Hello everyone, and welcome to another amazing story. What if Deku was a necromancer? This amazing story was written by Magnus9284. Please support them. Don't forget to like, sub, and leave a comment. Now let's dive in. Chapter 29. A Sinister Retaliation. Inside an oddly clean bar of seedy disposition, more so due to its dingy outward facade than the fact it was hidden away from public and heroic eye alike, mad scribbling and giggles could be heard if one were to listen closely. Yes. Shigaraki's nearly sang, his rasping voice dangerously close to cracking. The Blanchette was hunched over his spot at the bar, working over an old notebook, a healer that's not a fucking glass cannon. What a rare NPC. Scribble. Comes with his own minions too. The handsy villain's grin, covered by the one hand he almost never removed, would have chilled the blood of any normal person who witnessed it. It had crossed the line beyond creepy long ago. That means I don't have to waste high-level fodder on escorting him around. Scribble. Leadership's a bit high though. Shigaraki mused, pausing in his writing as he flicked his wild gaze to the misty bartender patiently cleaning a pristine glass across from him. Oi, Kurojairi. Should I nerf the healer's charisma before putting him in the party? The dapperly dressed villain gave a low sigh at the question. Between his charge's antics and those of the thoughtless children being paraded about on the television, the misty bartender had long ago crossed from simply irritated and had landed in flat-out annoyed. Thankfully he was distracted from the latest cause of his ire before he could give a knee-jerk reaction. Another of his annoyances, the sports festival's too-loud announcer present Mike, rather obnoxiously remarked about one of his own students losing their clothes. What an idiot. Before considering lowering another's charisma. Kurojairi trailed off, considering how to word his opinion without inciting another childish tantrum from his charge. Wouldn't it behoove you to attempt to raise your own first? There was a pregnant pause, and Kurojairi wondered if he'll be wiping up piles of dust again after closing for his words. The child sitting at his bar frowned, as if actually considering his words. Or more likely, whether or not to make his death a messy one or a brutal one. Why would I need more charisma? Shigaraki eventually replied, tilting his head in honest confusion. Last I checked, that stat looked high enough to me. Compared to whom? Kurojairi asked, completely out of reflex without a stitch of thought beforehand. At that moment, the monitor stuck in the wall of the bar flickered to life, the words, audio only, glowing on the screen. I see you've taken my suggestion to heart, young Tamura. Good. Instantly, both Shigaraki and Kurojairi stood at attention, neither making a sound. It went without saying that it was not their turn to speak. Your study of this boy will be imperative for the future, make no mistake. When the time comes, his quirk, and all its power, will ultimately serve you better as a willing ally rather than a forced servant. So take your time, young Tamura, and do all you can to understand him. The handsy villain grinned, wide and sick. This side quest had just been revealed to be way more important to the main story than he'd previously thought, and his proactive approach had caught his teacher's attention. Not only had he gotten the green light to continue, but also what sounded like permission to put a lot more focus into it than he'd been willing to before. This was going to be so much fun. He'd have to put together his own walkthrough though first, for once a potential ally was squarely on the enemy's side from the start, and he'd never dealt with that particular mechanic before. There's something else you could learn from this boy as well, young Tamura. The remark caused Shigaraki to stiffen slightly, wondering what he'd missed. The Blanchette hoped he hadn't disappointed his teacher somehow. That was never pleasant. Sensei? The handsy villain asked lowly, noting how his mentor's tone had changed ever so slightly. There was a pause. This Midoriya, whether he knows it or not, is able to deeply influence those around him. Watch him, and observe this. Discern the patterns of speech and interaction that give him this skill, and endeavor to make it your own. If you do, it will be you who influences him in the end. Shigaraki nodded silently, taking his teacher's words to heart. To the side, Kurojairi scoffed in his head, hadn't he just told his charge basically the same thing? Yes, sensei, Shigaraki said, the response heartfelt and full of purpose. The Blanchette had made up his mind, it was time to raise his charisma. He wished he'd have thought of that sooner. Without another word, the wall monitor cut out. Redacted. Cutting his communication to the bar, a sinister figure growled into the dark as he returned a specialized breathing apparatus to its place over his mouth and nose. He'd finally received all the information he'd been able to acquire about the boy, and he'd been left with more questions than answers. It turned out he hadn't been kept in the dark about the nascent necromancer by some new player after all, he'd just been misinformed from the start. The doctor who'd scouted a 4-year-old Midoriya had chalked his quirk's potential up to minor at best and useless at worst, both because it was a mutant type and because, at the time, its observable characteristics had seemed laughable. That doctor would no longer be giving such inaccurate reports. Then, the QRA, in all its standard incompetence, had decided to neglect all aspects of its job in keeping a vigilant eye on the boy over the years. Even when red flag after red flag had popped up, they'd done nothing but sweep the paperwork under the rug. By the time the boy had created his first enthralled zombie, it had been too late. Too many eyes had been the boy to attempt a kidnapping. And at the time, even he himself, in all his knowledge and wisdom, hadn't seen the boy as anything more than a fascination, a distraction. Never a real priority. Then his successor had played his little game at the USJ. Interpol had come onto the scene, and he'd been forced to keep his involvement even further removed for the time being. Not that he feared the spooks, oh no. Dealing with such monsters wasn't a problem when even nastier ones lurked in your own shadows. However, without the advantage of being able to strike without notice, any action he'd have been able to take in his current state would have led to unacceptable delays to his master plan. And now, this. Just when he'd found a mutant that was actually useful and wielded powerful abilities, ones that would change the game entirely, it turned out its quirk was sentient. Or at least, quasi-sentient? Regardless, quirks of any level of sentience were the worst. They always refused to cooperate with him, even if he managed to rip them from their original hosts. So, he'd adapted his strategy. A few words, and his successor was twisted just enough in the right direction to serve his purposes. Cursed blood may have been out of his reach, or maybe not, but either way the boy himself was a different matter entirely. Corrupting him was the key to achieving the optimal outcome. His return. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena? The festival was still amped up and running on all cylinders. After 2 fights that had ended on low notes, the following 3 had been wildly successful with the public. People were happy and excited, and looked forward to the finals, many making bets and predictions on who would make it there. But for the UA staff watching over the tournament, things appeared far bleaker. In particular, Midnight herself felt bad about what could happen in the next fight. Alright folks, are you ready? From the southwest gate, hailing from the support course, it's the girl who's managed the impossible and fought through the naturally gifted to earn her chance to prove just how dangerous her intellect can be. It's May Hatsum. Entering the ring at a light trot, waving at the cameras the entire time, came the pink-haired inventor. May couldn't help her manic grin as she stepped onto the arena's raised flooring. She'd made it. Now those big shots from the support companies would have to look at her and her babies. The Pinkette was certain that after this match, everyone would be falling all over themselves to get their hands on her tech. All she needed to do was ensure that all her babies got a turn to really shine. It was too bad that the bird-headed kid she was about to face off against hadn't wanted to be her test dumb spokesman. Oh well. And from the northeast gate, rising up from the shadows of his classmates, it's the boy so intimidating he already haunts the nightmares of some real-life villains. Give it up for Fumikage Tokoyami. Fumikage stepped out of the tunnel and calmly walked to the ring to little cheer from the general public. While it was true his quirk was technically emitter type, his more visible hereditary mutation all but eclipsed that fact to many. Not to mention Dark Shadow as usually automatically classified as dark purely based on appearances alone. And if that wasn't enough, the quirk entity was officially labeled as a summon creature, bound to his body and forced to serve his will. That meant on paper he had a type of enslavement quirk, and nobody but the sick and twisted showed any love for those. But in reality, even as theatrical as he sometimes was, Fumikage was actually close friends with his quirk. The two shared opposing personalities, which meshed surprisingly well, and both enjoyed scaring other people. For years, outside of his parents, they'd been the only one the other could count on. And then Fumikage had befriended one Izuku Midoriya. Such a simple event had at first seemed fairly straightforward. The Verdunette was the only one he felt he could relate to in a class full of strangers, and it would make his life more pleasant to have at least one friend that didn't live in his stomach. But it just hadn't stopped there. Fumikage had found himself with more friends than he'd ever thought he'd have, and above that, a girlfriend. And he'd gotten drunk and had sex, well, kind of. Since his first day at UA, his life had irrevocably changed, and the raven-headed boy knew he'd never regret offering his support to his green friend. All the same, Fumikage felt like a part of him was now out of reach, the smiling Pinkette across from him more than proof enough at that. Where he'd have once wallowed in his edginess and seen only a self-centered airhead, someone to just write off, now he saw a friend, even if only by proxy for now. When Hatsum had approached him before their match, Fumikage knew the old him would have been immediately suspicious of the cheerful support student. His experience with strangers had never been good, and he'd have immediately gone on the defensive. Now, instead, he'd politely asked what she'd wanted, honestly curious. He'd listened to Hatsum's babbled request to use her tech during the match to promote her genius to the world and truthfully thought it over before refusing. Her counter-refusal, and bargain to forfeit the match after showcasing her babies, had admittedly annoyed him though. Begin. Midnight's shout broke the dark teen from his thoughts, and not a moment too soon. Mei quickly activated her utility belt and combat harness with 2 flicks of her wrist and a few taps of her deft fingers. Whirring sounds could barely be heard coming from the support student as unseen motion sensors and finely tuned gyros slid, clicked, and locked into place. The hidden machines were ready to respond and adapt the moment their mother made her move. This was it. Mei was ready to begin her first real-life sales pitch. It was time to put on a show. Then, Dark Shadow leapt from its home in Tokoyami's stomach and was on her. Bam! Instinctively Mei lifted her arms up in self-defense, the motion activating the sensors in her combat harness. The multiple devices shared programming correctly assumed their user was under attack, and reacted accordingly. Plasteel bars, reinforced with carbon fibers, sprung from the pouch on her back, unfolding into bars far larger than their previously compact existence would have implied. The bars mirrored Mei's raised arms, blocking Dark Shadow's talons at the last second. Neither competitor budged. "Hey!" The Pinkette snapped, more upset than anything at the sudden attack. "Let me advertise my babies first." Pushing with all her not inconsiderable might, and assisted by the strength of her baby, Mei managed to slowly press Dark Shadow back and off of her. Then Fumikage charged forward and joined the fray. Bam! This time, Mei and her mechanical limbs had less trouble blocking the avian teen's attack, a kick to her knee. However, the glare she received from her opponent made the mad inventor flinch all the same. "Then do so." Fumikage grit out, struggling to overcome the hydraulics of the plasteel limbs. Leaning in, the raven-headed teen spoke in at a level only the 2 combatants could hear. "Show, don't tell." Message given, Dark Shadow disengaged and covered the duo's retreat, leaving a slightly confused inventor behind. "Show?" Mei murmured, mind unable to help itself but ponder over the cryptic words. In the split second it took for the Pinkette to realize what she'd been told, Fumikage wordlessly said about recreating the imposing form he'd last used during the USJ, knowing that combining with his quirk here would give the 2 of them a better chance of overcoming whatever the support student would be able to cook up. Unfortunately, he was only partially successful. At his current skill, it appeared to Fumikage that he could only manage to partially cover himself with Dark Shadow when the sun's rays beat down directly on the duo. The bright light made it difficult for the quirk entity to function at full capacity, but even so, the avian teen did eventually succeed in coating his upper back, forearms, hands, and lower legs in writhing darkness. Meanwhile, Mei looked on and examined the challenge before her with rarely felt trepidation. The Pinkette finally understood that there would be no room for her to give a sales pitch in this match. Not if she wanted a chance to advertise her babies before she was thrown out of the ring. "Demonstration it is then," Mei said, more to herself than anyone in particular. Raising her hands to her combat harness, the mad inventor gave a sharp tug and activated the battle-ready babies that had been hiding away. The plasteel bars that had bracketed the Pinkette's arms shifted, plates rotated, unfolded, reformed, and ultimately relocked into the unmistakable shape of thick, gauntlet-like bracers. This newest form of Mei's baby covered her hands as well, sonic projectors layering over her knuckles just in time to take the brunt of another attack courtesy of her opponent. Bam! A massive claw of living shadow collided against one of Mei's now reinforced arms, the other pulled back in anticipation. Putting her muscles into it, the Pinkette countered, striking out with a metal-encased fist. Boom! Sheer force sent Fumikage skidding back, his own reinforced arms now crossed to absorb as much damage as possible. It was a good thing he didn't feel anything through Dark Shadow's eldritch form. That would have hurt otherwise. Blinking wide-eyed at the power her baby had given her simple punch, Mei felt a shock of concern shoot through her stomach even as it fought with the thrill of witnessing a successful test run. Had she just damaged one of the few friends she had, even if he was one more by proxy at the moment? What would Midoriya say? Before she could overthink, the Pinkette saw through her opponent's crossed arms for a second. Was that what a smiling beak looked like? The odd sight vanished abruptly, however, as Fumikage gathered himself and charged forward once again. Bam! The raven-headed teen's next assault struck like a meteor, raised nubs on his shadow fists completely tearing into and trashing one of Mei's bracers. B.O. boom! Fumikage's follow-up hit only concrete, shattering the arena's flooring with ease. Mei had been no fool, easily understanding that her gear, cobbled together with the only materials first years were given access to for personal projects, wouldn't last long if she just stood there and took damage. Luckily, her sensor babies had come through. From the pouch on her back, the Pinkette's machines had erupted into view, grappling hooks shooting out and gouging themselves into the ground a distance away from the aggressive variable attacking. The launching of the hooks had triggered May's hover boots, and the clunky metal footwear had roared to life to enable their creator to effortlessly slide to safety. With a hiss, the damaged bracer fell to the ground and another plasteel limb took its place, this one mecha shifting into what was clearly a launcher of some sort. Fumikage pulled back to prepare just as May pointed the new armament in his direction. Thumph! A weighted net shot at the raven-headed teen, unfurled in midair, and was promptly torn asunder by Fumicage's dark and shadowy claws. Holy moly folks! That support girl is some kind of crazy, right? But Tokoyami proves he's the real predator by taking his opponent's inventions in stride. Seriously, Eraser, what the heck are you teaching your kids? Present Mick's energetic commentary wiped the stadium crowd into a frenzy. Some seemed to agree with the voice hero, feeling that the dark kid with a bird's head was clearly going to come out on top. Others, mostly those who were glaring at said teen, still argued that a proper competitor like the support student would eventually take the day. Of course, both sides argued vigorously, citing their preferred combatant's potential and the incredible skill they'd already shown. As this was happening, representatives from various support companies looked on with scrutiny. If the girl's toys managed to function after taking the abuse her foe was clearly able to dish out, then maybe she would be worth something. Maybe. What Tokoyami is doing, is showing his opponent respect. Hatsum is a part of the support course, a non-combatant, but he's treating her as a real threat regardless. Never judge a book by its cover. The underground hero's dull words rippled through the audience, looks of understanding and approval quickly outnumbering those of disgust and derision. Boom! The launcher was reduced to scrap by a well-executed fake-out. Instantly, another limb of plasteel unfolded and replaced it with a large tower shield. Boom! A jab with her remaining sonic projector gave May a temporary respite and she gained just enough ground to take a moment to breathe. This fight is proof positive that the potential to be a hero can be found even in those without combat-oriented quirks. Eraserhead's follow-up left a sour taste in the mouths of many pro-heroes watching the match, those being individuals who were a little too proud of the natural advantages their specific quirks gave them in combat. The representatives from the support companies, however, began in earnest to examine the little pinkette striving as the living shadow stood against her. Perhaps there was profit to be found in after all? As this was happening up in the stands, Fumikage and May hadn't stopped one bit. Gah! The pinkette screamed, tumbling back after a particularly powerful sideswipe struck home. The mad inventor knew she was in trouble. Most of her babies had fallen by now, broken beyond serviceability, or were simply unfit for the situation at hand. It looked like her only option now was bringing out the latest addition to her loadout. Clink! 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 The four mechanical spider-like limbs from the cavalry battle came back online, breaking May's fall and making her stand upright with ease. Straightening, the pinkette gave a fierce grin as she challenged her sort of friend once more. This was her last stand. My babies are all broken or useless. May mumbled to herself, watching Fumikage for the slightest twitch even as the avian teen likewise sized her and her new limbs up with sharp eyes. If I can't make this work. The mad inventor didn't dare finish that line of thinking. As much as she'd like to believe otherwise, May knew that passion and talent weren't enough in the cutthroat world of hero support, not by a long shot. If you couldn't prove to the major players that your creations weren't just frail toys, then at best they'd just brush you aside, blacklist you at worst for wasting their time. In the pinkette's mind, every baby she'd shown so far hadn't been good enough. They'd gone up against a powerful opponent, and while normally she'd see failure as just another opportunity to grow, that wasn't an option here. Not to say she saw herself as a failure, but she'd be lying if she said she didn't feel a little disappointment at her invention's lackluster performance. So much for her great sales pitch. Come on! May screamed suddenly, fed up with her spiraling thoughts. The mad inventor rushed Fumikage and took a swipe with one of her mechanized spider legs. Boom! I know you were born on the fly. May continued, her attack blocked by Fumicage's dark shadow-enhanced leg. In return, the avian teen swiped at her head with talons of hardened darkness. Bam! But you're still my baby. May was nearly in tears as she used two spider limbs to block and push Fumikage back. A step at a time, the pinkette forced the raven-headed teen closer and closer to the edge of the arena. Crash! And that means you're better than anyone else's. May pushed harder, straining with everything she had. Concrete shattered under the battling students, each step more powerful than the last. She couldn't hear it, but at that moment the stadium was shaking with the cheers the public was giving for her. She couldn't see them, but the support company representatives were beginning to loudly bicker amongst themselves over who would have the first chance to negotiate with her. She couldn't feel it, but her muscles were screaming louder than she was, her natural arms and legs quivering with fatigue and battle damage. None of that registered. May only had eyes for her opponent, she only had ears for the pained whirring of her last baby as it fought for her. Hiya! Boom! A final overhead strike, using two spider limbs together, swung down, and shattered only concrete. Utilizing Dark Shadow's power in his legs, Fumikage had expertly evaded the attack by launching himself up and over May, positioning himself behind the Pinkette. Before she had a chance to turn and face him, the raven-headed teen countered, a single swipe ripping the mechanical spider limbs from her combat harness. May was on her own. Bam! The mad inventor just barely reacted fast enough to block one final punch, but it wasn't enough. And Hatsum is out of bounds. Midnight's sudden declaration caused both Fumikage and May to pause, the two looking at each other in confusion. Then they looked down to see, yes, the Pinkette's large and clunky hover boots were touching grass. Tokoyami wins the match. The applause and cheering that was already shaking the stadium exploded. Coming back to reality, May realized that the positive reception wasn't just for her victorious maybe friend, but also for her. They were praising her effort. That was amazing. Don't give up. You'll get him next time. Please make my gear. What is happening? May asked, feeling funny all of a sudden. And why was her voice all watery and quivering like that? They celebrate, Fumikage said, squaring up as the mad inventor turned her full attention to him. They rejoice that you, one who is not a fighter, could withstand my darkness for so long, and so bravely. There could be no greater advertisement for your craft than that. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Class 1A seating box. I knew it, Izuku whispered, nonetheless drawing the attention of those closest to him. He was giving her the chance to show off. The Emerald Necromancer's chuckling was soon seconded by his girlfriends, soon joined by the Saki and Lily. Tay merely cocked her head to the side in blank question. Oh, so the lug can be soft when he wants to be. Kyuka quipped, uncaring who heard her while she was too focused on watching her newly minted boyfriend and lover help Hatsum leave the arena. The Pinkette looked about ready to collapse. Well, he's got no excuse for next time then. Fortunately for the raven-headed teen, no one sitting in the 1A seats understood what their musically inclined classmate was implying by her odd choice of words. I'm leaving now, Karo, Tsuyu announced, standing up. The frog girl would have made her way down to the field, but was pulled back by her caring boyfriend, who was too reticent to let go of her hand. She gave him a flat look. I'll be fine, Izuku-kun. Of course you will be, Izuku said, shyly letting go of the hand he'd instinctively grabbed when he'd felt Tsuyu moving away from him. Geez. Calm down, boss. Saki grinned, quick to latch onto her master. The thrum of the bond sang through the blonde as she wrapped her arms around the verdinette. She's tougher than she looks. It was only by the grace of having helped raise two younger siblings that Tsuyu was able to just barely contain the burning desire to pry the undead delinquent off of her boyfriend. Luckily for the former gang leader, the festival demanded she leave right at that moment. That didn't stop Tsuyu from sending Tay a meaningful look. The Ravenette wordlessly reached out and grabbed Saki by the back of the head, single-handed. The amphibian teen didn't stick around to see what her boyfriend's first partner was going to do to his third, but she trusted the blank zombie girl to get the job done. Let's go, Tsuchan. The bubbly cheer came from a smiling Achiko, who'd stood up with Tsuyu and now began to walk beside the frog girl. Let's treat this just like a battle trial, the anti-gravity girl offered, no hard feelings and may the best girl win, right? Tsuyu croaked in agreement, but as the two walked through the stadium's halls heading to the point where they'd have to separate, she frowned. Something told the frog girl that regardless of what she said, the cherubic brunette wasn't going to see their match in such a carefree way. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena, later. Midnight had, with a few obvious exceptions, been enjoying this year's sports festival so far. Honestly, the first year's portion being rigged far beyond what was acceptable had been one of the only dark spots. And of course, there was the fact that a few of the competitors had gotten a little too rough earlier. But for the most part, it had been a blast. There'd been sexual tension, manliness and bravado, heroic levels of determination, and top-tier sportsmanship. What more could you ask for in an event like this? Apparently, the answer to that turned out to be two teenage girls radiating unhealthy levels of hostility at each other. From the southwest gate, it's the cherubic cutie who'll literally send you to heaven with a single touch. Mike. Oh, calm down, Killjoy, it's Achiko Uraraka. Achiko stepped up to the arena with a face set stiffly in complete concentration, the brunette's determination to win bleeding off of her. Losing the chance to be with Izuku before she'd even had it had been a painful experience, and while Achiko would say that she'd let the verdinette go by now, that didn't mean she didn't still have a score to settle with the frog girl waiting for her introduction on the opposite side of the field. Really, it was her pride as a woman at this point which demanded she seek retribution from her classmate. Being beaten out by mere minutes, as she'd later found out, was the kind of thing that required a special reconciliation before it could truly be called even. Winning at the sports festival would also prove her worth to the Ida family. Or at least, Achiko hoped it would, to the point where she'd feel less guilty about getting stuck with the label of being an Ida's girlfriend. She wasn't dumb enough, nor was she deaf, to miss what was being said about them when others thought they weren't listening. And from the northeast gate comes her opponent. Don't let her looks fool you folks, this girl can kick some serious butt, and is brave enough to date UA's resident necromancer to boot. It's Tsuyu Asui. With that, Tsuyu hopped her way to the arena. Even through the cacophony of a packed stadium, the frog girl thought she could hear stray giggling directed at her. The firstborn daughter of Baru Azui was in no way naive. What Izuku had revealed to her and her friends was completely true. They'd been set up to fail from the start. This matchup was just another example of someone cherry-picking the matches to fit their worldview of emitter supremacy. Or at least, that's what she bet the bigoted quirkists were thinking. Defeating Todoroki was a no-go, full stop. If she went up against her two-tone classmate, Tsuyu knew she'd be putting herself in serious danger. His ice could, and would, put her into a hibernation so deep she was afraid she'd never wake up. A shiver shot through the amphibian teen at the thought. It was a daunting future to consider. But Achiko? Really? Were the idiots even thinking? Or were they really that blind? Tsuyu wasn't one to underestimate her opponents. She wasn't an idiot, and personal experience had proven to her that anyone, no matter how innocent-looking, could hurt you if you weren't careful. But there was still a remarkable difference between them that couldn't be ignored. It had been clear from the very first day that the brunette had never really trained before coming to UA. Not like she had. But that didn't mean she was going to go easy on her. Achiko still had to pay for attempting to seduce her boyfriend, regardless of whether or not she knew the cinnamon roll was taken at the time. And Saki, that blonde troublemaker, needed to learn what would happen if she kept pushing buttons better left alone. There was only so much of the rebellious zombie girls leering at Izuku that she would take before she did something about it. Lowering her guard and taking things for granted was inviting disaster, and Tsuyu wasn't about to let anything destroy her happiness. Just because she was usually a nice person didn't mean she didn't feel the need to mark her territory every now and then. "All right, ladies," Midnight said, raising a hand into the air, "remember the rules, and don't forget that you're both heroines in training. Begin." "Here I go." Achiko's sudden shout nearly left her stumbling as she took off toward Azui, a jolting stomp with her right leg the only thing keeping her from face-planting. No. This was her moment. She was going to prove her worth. To herself, to Tenya, to the world. Tsuyu was already on her. Ga-uff. Achiko hit the ground with a grunt of pain and surprise. She hadn't even seen Azui move. What had just happened? What had happened was that Tsuyu had crouched and launched herself at the brunette with all the strength her mutated legs could muster. The frog girl had reached her opponent nearly instantly and, with a quick leg sweep, sent the other girl to the ground without hesitation. Not even attempting to stand back up, Achiko reacted as quickly as she could, reaching out a hand to grab at Tsuyu's legs. If she could just use her quirk, the match would be over, but the brunette only managed to swipe some loose gravel. The frog girl had already leapt out of reach in the time it took her to hit the ground and attempt to counter. At least the ring was still a mess from the last match. Between maze machines breaking and both competitors smashing the concrete flooring to pieces, there were definitely enough chunks of debris for, that could work. "You'll have to try a lot harder than that if you want to catch me, Uraraka-chan," Tsuyu stated, the comment not even coming across as a taunt due to the frog girl's flat tone. "Unfortunately, I'm not going to give you the time to get better, Karo." Achiko hauled herself to her feet in response, surreptitiously trailing her fingers across more broken concrete as she did. She glared back at her stoic opponent. "I'm not giving up." The brunette shouted, taking a rather sloppy stance that might have been combat-worthy if Tsuyu were drunk and blindfolded. In the time it took the anti-gravity girl to blink, Tsuyu was on her again. There was another attempt to grab the frog girl, and another, but Achiko's target seemed to disappear each time she came close. To make matters worse, each time Tsuyu evaded, she would lash out with her own counter, landing bruising strikes on the anti-gravity girl's abdomen, back, arms, and legs. Achiko was certain she'd be feeling this fight for days after this. She just had to make sure the pain was worth it then. Would you look at that, folks? Another underdog comes out and trashes the competition. It's another shock in a day full of incredible sights. The voice hero's rather opinionated words resonated with a sizable amount of the public, both in the stadium in person and watching from televisions at home, work, and beyond. While the cute brunette might have been a nobody, her opponent was just a girl with a simple mutation that gave her frog features. Frog. Surely an emitter, of any strength, should have been able to handle mutant of such low caliber. Right? Right. This shouldn't come as such a surprise, people. While Achiko Uraraka has an admittedly powerful quirk, she's only a first year, and like many of them lacks experience using it in actual combat. On the other hand, Tsuyu Azui actually has some of that experience her opponent is missing. Eraserhead's cold, calculated explanation came as the gruff man reminisced over his amphibious student's file. The girl's grades had been high, but her record had been spotted. There'd been several reports of physical altercations throughout her earlier education, always against other students. It was an unfortunate commonality that most mutant-type students shared. And also unfortunately common, was having the blame completely laid on said students. The staff at the Azui girls' schools had, by and large, attempted to frame the events as nothing more than a girl with an inferiority complex lashing out against her peers. But Shoyuta wasn't an idiot, and he knew the truth was much different than what was reported. Tsuyu Azui being a victim of bullying wasn't a theory, it was a fact. Her quirk and the physical mutations it gave her were more than enough reason for some people to direct their ire at her. Naturally, she developed instincts and behaviors to avoid or minimize harm, and when those hadn't worked, she'd fallen back on the last viable option, defend herself. Luckily for the poor girl, being Baru Azui's daughter gave her the unique ability to never face too much backlash from putting a stop to these aggressions. Of course, Shoyuta was sure that hadn't stopped them from being a common occurrence in her life. In stark contrast, Shuta's other student in the arena had reportedly lived a much more peaceful life. Her parents, while poorer than many, had led calm lives and had emphatically refused to allow their daughter to use her quirk to their own benefit. It was a nice thought, but that refusal had cost Uraraka the opportunity to train her abilities at all before attending UA. Everyone knows that quirks are like muscles. If you don't use them, you lose them, potential be damned. And in this match it boils down to a complete greenhorn facing off against a girl who's basically lived with her quirk constantly on. Every single day. As the words of the underground hero sunk in for the everyday civilian, many of the pros listening found themselves nodding. Many of them had had to learn that lesson the hard way, and many others still knew of coworkers who'd never get a chance to learn it. Of course, there were still diehard quirkists who disagreed with Eraserhead's impromptu lesson. Experience was all well and good, but in the end it was the power that came from pedigree that would ultimately win the day. Surely. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Class 1A seating box. So, Kyuka pondered in an exaggerated fashion, not caring if her classmates were listening. According to Aizawa-sensei, that would make you two bodybuilders, right? The not-so-innocent question had been directed at the two boys sitting beside the punk rocker girl, her boyfriend Fumikage, and her now former crush and current best friend, Izuku. Behind the verdant necromancer, a playful scoff cut through the background noise of the cheering crowd. More like pro wrestlers, Saki countered, her crimson eyes taking on a playful glint. The boss has got real muscle with real power, none of that empty mass caused by shooting up hormones. Beside the smirking delinquent, Lily frowned at her sister and the way she was eyeing her big brother. Lily thinks Blondie really needs to stop before Tsune finds out she was having weird thoughts again, the littlest zombie girl interjected. She really didn't want to deal with the blonde's antics right now. We don't need more weird thoughts. The former gang leader spun and glared heatedly at the twerp next to her. Shut it, shrimpy. Saki groused, quick to retaliate, go be childish elsewhere and let the adults do adult things in peace. Leaning over from her own seat behind the group, Momo looked back and forth between the two undead now locked in a staring match. Weird thoughts? The heiress asked, a mix of confusion and concern. What do you mean weird? What are you trying to teach my Lily-chan? Another scoff ripped through the air from the blonde zombie girl. Probably nothing as bad as that smut you read, princess, Saki threw out, still holding Lily's narrowed gaze. Smut? Kyuka choked out in surprise. The musically inclined heroine in training whipped around to stare at her mature classmate in shock. She wasn't the only one. Saki-chan. But Izuku didn't react more than a long blink and a sigh. The verdant necromancer didn't want this kind of argument to explode right now, not while he was trying to focus on Tsuchan's match. At least he'd managed to cover Lily's ears in time. Oh come on boss. The delinquent moaned, foreseeing the end of her fun. It's not hard to tell those books the princess sneaks are more fuck-focused than educational. That might have been true, but the members of Izuku's friend group had tacitly agreed to avoid the subject for their own good. Let us return our attention to the battle? Fumikage quickly offered, hoping to interrupt with one of the only distractions that was sure to put a pin in the discussion no one wanted to have. It was easier said than done, however, as watching the brunette below be overwhelmed by their froggy friend wasn't a pretty sight. Not in the least. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena? Achiko rolled across the arena floor after a particularly nasty kick to her side, feeling no less than 3 ribs shift from the attack. Her quirk, zero gravity, looked on paper as if it would have been more than enough to win a close-quarters combat scenario like this match. Too bad for her that Azui turned out to be way too agile of an opponent. If she took her eyes off the frog girl for even a second, even to blink, then she'd end up being circled and inevitably suffer another kick or strike soon after. She'd blinked 8 times so far. Blink. Kick. Tumble. Touch. Stand. Repeat. The brunette hated to admit it, but she was out of her league here. She'd started her training to be a heroine, sure, but her body just wasn't ready for this level of confrontation. Her stamina was crap, and this fight was like trying to catch a frog with her bare hands. It was too early for her last resort too. Keeping her guard up, Achiko took a moment to take stock of the situation. She was battered and on her last legs. Azui didn't even look winded. There was still a ton of rubble and debris cluttering the field, even though she'd been implementing her backup plan the entire time. Maybe if close range wasn't an option, long range would work better? Directing one final glare at Azui, who still held her flat gaze and quasi-pleasant smile intact, Achiko decided to work with what she had on hand. Literally. Do you want to continue this, Uraraka-chan? Tsuyu asked, tilting her head to the side. The frog girl watched as her opponent eyed the arena before glaring at her. Karo? Was it something I said? I'm far from done. And then Uraraka threw a head-sized piece of concrete at her. For its size, the now flying piece of rubble shot through the air with much more force and speed than one would have expected. Tsuyu managed to dodge the projectile, but it was a near thing. Looking over her shoulder, the frog girl risked a moment to see where the debris landed. But it didn't. Oi! No one told me Uraraka-san had such strength. Present mixed shrill exclamation echoed how many in the stadium's audience felt in that moment. She doesn't. Uraraka-san's quirk has a wide range of possible applications. Due to low usage until now, even she doesn't know its limits. Twink. An unexpectedly weak sound of something hitting glass came from the window of the announcer's booth. Looking away from each other and back down to the field, the 2 pro heroes in the room saw that the piece of rubble had hit the transparent divider, but had done no damage. Such speed and mass should have had no problems breaking through solid concrete, let alone glass, but there the debris was, floating innocently in front of them. It looked like while something was under the effects of Uraraka's quirk, there was no relative mass to accompany its impact if she threw it at something else, nor any inertial energy to transfer. Ultimately, she could throw a building and it'd bounce like a balloon if she was able to keep her quirk activated. Aizawa realized all of this nearly instantly and decided not to voice his thoughts over the intercom. Uraraka had to know her ranged capabilities came with such a caveat, and if she didn't, she needed to learn. Additionally, Azui needed to figure out the bluff on her own. Analysis during combat was a valuable skill after all. Back down in the arena, Tsuyu didn't appreciate her opponent's change in tactics. Oh sure, she could understand Uraraka's reasoning for it. She'd proven herself the better melee fighter, so all that was left to the brunette was ranged combat. It was her bad luck that such a move brought back ugly memories. It turned out children could be exceedingly cruel and nasty beasts, especially when they believed their cruelty was right. Quirkism had been a reality for Tsuyu since elementary school, where every day was an exercise in facing harsh insults and snide comments about her amphibious features and animalistic mannerisms. And as bad as it had been for developing her younger self-esteem, middle school had been a much worse hell. The blatant insults. The laughter. The brutal pranks. It had been bad enough in public, but if she'd allowed herself to be caught by the other students away from watching eyes? Whoosh! Tsuyu evaded another flying piece of concrete with practiced ease. Compared to back when she'd been younger, Uraraka's assault was nothing. What are you aiming for, Uraraka-chan? Tsuyu asked, not breaking stride in evading the flying debris. A trace of concern flickered across her face as she realized her opponent looked different than when they'd started the match. Are you okay? You're not looking so good, Karo. The frog girl wasn't wrong. Anyone with eyes could tell that the zero-gravity user was getting progressively sicklier the longer she extended her quirk usage. As it was, the brunette was obviously beginning to struggle to breathe, and her movements, and aiming, were getting worse. I'm all right, Achiko replied, grunting through pants and gasps for air. I only need to last a bit longer. Tsuyu shook her head. There was really no more need to fight, neither of them had anything else to prove. Uraraka was on her last legs, and kicking her any more would definitely be seen as overkill. But she couldn't just drag her out of bounds, that'd look even worse for the brunette. Nodding to herself after a bit of thought, the frog girl decided she'd put her opponent in a submission hold, giving her classmate one last chance to show her resistance before the inevitable end. "Wait!" Achiko shouted suddenly, just as Tsuyu took a step forward. The sudden demand took the frog girl by surprise, so much so she actually stopped. "Don't come any closer." Shaking off her surprise at the brunette's determination to keep fighting, Tsuyu took another step forward. She did, however, allow herself to become a bit more wary though. If her opponent seemed to have one last bit of fighting spirit left in her, then she could do anything. It honestly wouldn't surprise the frog girl if her opponent pulled out some sort of final stand move right now. But that still wouldn't prevent her victory. Another step. Achiko gave a wicked grin, a look Tsuyu had never seen on the brunette's face before. It was oddly disconcerting. "Don't say I didn't warn you," the brunette said, bringing her hands together. Release. Years of facing bullies both as their victim and detractor had honed Tsuyu's fighting instincts to a fine edge. She felt the attack coming the moment her opponent had put her fingertips together. Looking up, the frog girl barely had a moment to react as a veritable landslide began to fall on her head. Having gambled her very health and safety on this tactic, Achiko hoped it worked, nothing else had seemed to. She'd been gathering the debris since the beginning, after that first time she'd been struck down, all because she'd had the passing thought it might be useful later. Maintaining the cluster of concrete rubble had been extremely taxing, but the trap had been a last resort anyway. There hadn't been enough left over from the previous matches to make a proper weapon. It would have taken a much more destructive battle for that to have happened, but it had been enough. Throwing the debris earlier had been both a distraction and a test. She'd needed to buy time, and see if her quirk affected the objects under it when they collided with other things. It was lucky she had, or she wouldn't have known that she had to turn her quirk off for flying objects to be effective projectile weapons. Even as she basked in her impending victory, Achiko knew there wouldn't be any more battles for her that day. She could feel a twinge in her stomach that told her another attempt at using her quirk anytime soon would result in her stomach saying hello to the world. "You're going to need to try harder than that." Achiko paled, watching as her opponent almost nonchalantly dodged the falling rubble. "If you want to hit me with all this." Tsuyu, her instincts honed over the years on top of being affected by her mutation, had almost inhuman reflexes at this point. She could tell where each piece of rubble was going to fall, and in what order. She could judge which she needed to prioritize avoiding, and which ones she could take a hit from and take minimal damage. Having forced herself to develop the ability to suppress the knee-jerk reaction to shield her eyes from incoming attacks, she was also able to never lose track of what was happening around her. However, this talent also worked against her. While she was busy avoiding Uraraka's final attack, the brunette herself had thrown her last shred of self-preservation out the window, charging into the fray herself. She knew she wasn't capable of standing against Todoroki, even at full strength. This had always been her last fight, her last chance to prove that she deserved to be in UA's heroics course. She just needed to use her quirk one more time, and she'd have proven her worth. "You're done!" Achiko screamed, pushing into Tsuyu right as the frog girl avoided a large piece of rubble. A pink glow flashed into existence as she activated her quirk. "Bye-bye!" Tsuyu yelped in surprise as she began to float into the air, the sound ringing like victory bells to the zero-gravity user's ears. Now that her opponent was helpless and drifting in the direction of the nearest edge of the arena? Look at that! What a reversal! Uraraka comes from behind and now Asui is helpless in the air. Feeling emboldened by present mixed words, Achiko almost cheered. She felt ready to claim her place as the better girl, and win this match. Who's the better girl now, Tsu-chan? Okay, so the brunette couldn't help herself. But it felt good to release all that built-up bitterness and disappointment from earlier in the year. She'd settled her defeat in the love department by taking the field of combat, and now she could go back to being the happy girl she'd been before. Of course, she didn't expect Midoriya to suddenly drop the frog girl and pursue her. That ship had sailed, but at least she could now say that Itakuin hadn't settled for second best and taken in a worthless girl. Clever usage of terrain is an important skill for a hero to have. From finding cover to weaponizing even the most random of objects, anything should be considered while in the middle of a battle. I would say Uraraka did a good job, but unfortunately, she forgot another vital piece of combat protocol. Achiko stilled, feeling herself shiver at the words of her homeroom teacher. Why did she have a feeling something bad was about to happen? Never turn your back on an enemy when you don't know their full capabilities. Suddenly, something long, sticky, and pink shot into view and wrapped around the brunette's hand. Eh? Achiko didn't even have a chance to react. Tsuyu had not only captured one of her opponent's hands, but she'd also managed to anchor herself from floating farther away. And thanks to the muscles in her tongue being extraordinarily strong, far stronger than any normal humans, she could use it as a whip or a grappling hook. Wham! Ugh! Ochako grunted loudly in pain as a double-footed kick slammed into her with the force of a truck, throwing her backward. The brunette rolled a few times before losing enough momentum to finally stop. To the surprise of all watching, the Azui girl had managed to put force behind her attack by retracting her tongue at full throttle. Even effectively massless, she'd moved at a speed that had delivered a punishing amount of force. Managing to raise her head up, Ochako saw that Azui was no longer floating away. In fact, the frog girl was crouched down, firmly latched onto the ground by her hands and feet. And her quirk was still active. Azui's quirk, Frog, gives her more than enough tools to counteract the effects of Uraraka's zero gravity. To note a few, her tongue can extend quite a distance, her hands and feet can excrete a sticky substance to keep her stuck to most surfaces, and then there's her superior leg strength, of course. Uraraka's plan was admittedly a good one, but ultimately it matched up poorly against an opponent armed with effective countermeasures. Struggling to keep her head up, Ochako quietly seethed as Aizawa-sensei went over her oversight. How had she forgotten what her classmate's quirk could do? I am not. Ochako stuttered, forcing the word out. Her body quivered as she fruitlessly pushed against the ground, but her legs wouldn't move, and the aches and pains nearly overwhelmed her. It felt like moving through lead. I'm not. Wham! A solid piece of concrete about the size of a silver American dollar struck the side of the brunette's head, knocking her out cold. Tsuyu slowly raised herself up to her full height, feeling her gravity return. She'd been done with playing around and risking her victory any further. And the victory goes to Tsuyu Azui. Midnight declared, amazed at the tenacity of these two young girls. The provocative heroine then growled as instead of raucous cheers the victorious frog girl only received a mixed response from the stadium's crowd. Huffing, the Ravenette decided to just keep the ball rolling. Now let's get ready for the next fight. Osamentas? I think we can't put off cleaning duty any longer. Tsuyu didn't bother glaring at the lukewarm public, their mixed disappointment and shock at her win wasn't her concern. Still, being a good sport, the frog girl waved. And if she directed most of her waving to the area in the stands she knew her boyfriend and friends to be sitting, well, that was her business. Just thinking of Izuku impatiently awaiting her return to his side made Tsuyu feel warm inside. Meanwhile, UA's redacted. And you're certain of this? Nizu's normally measured voice trembled in suppressed outrage and fear as he spoke to the shadowed figure across from him. A single nod was the only response for a number of minutes. Eventually, the silence became too much, even for the denizen of the shadows. I am, replied the darkened figure, voice still as sweet as ever, even though now it held a serious edge sharp enough to kill a lesser man. As much as I wish I wasn't. Agent Smith, at least the only one that Nizu had ever dealt with personally, had always been a rather fond friend of UA and its principal. She hadn't attended herself, of course, but it had been the alma mater of a long list of heroes worthy of the name that had aided Interpol over the years. Case in point, her own darling had been a graduate himself. He was the first pro-hero with an empathy quirk to successfully graduate from UA, in fact. And Smith was so proud of him for that, especially since he also became the youngest pro to retire with no debilitating wounds as the cause. She knew the others felt the same way too. And now, the spook knew that her soft spot for the institution had been irreparably tarnished. All thanks to the greed of the pathetic piece of gutter trash cowering before her. Why you can't do this? Whimpered the pink-haired security advisor weakly. The middle-aged woman was bloodied, and most definitely in need of immediate medical attention. I have our rights. Nizu turned to what was left of Haruno, his beady eyes showing exactly zero warmth or concern. I apologize, Haruno-san, the quirked animal said, clearly not sorry at all about what had happened to the Rosette, but I'm afraid human rights no longer apply to those in your situation. Agent Smith tossed a bank sheet onto the table between herself and the disgraced security advisor, the document recently printed. To those who could follow the massive numbers clearly, the figures were quite damning. Money had been transferred in large amounts to the Rosette's account, sure, but that didn't matter so much when stacked against the account that had actually been doing the paying. You accepted money from an account linked to a known terrorist, the spook explained, sweetness almost completely draining from her voice. Dread could viscerally be felt filling the room. One that's considered an enemy to the entire world, who's to be stopped at all costs. The disgraced woman visibly paled at the revelation. I didn't know. Haruno cried, tears leaking down her quivering cheeks. Everything appeared legal. It just seemed like a new sponsor. Please, my lawyer can explain. The rosette's voice trailed off as the room's temperature took an abruptly steep dive. Haruno could feel her heart struggling to beat, her instincts screaming at her to run away from the dreadful monster standing over her. Even Nizu found himself inching away from his associate. Lawyer? Agent Smith asked, chuckling darkly. The spook reached up and placed her slim fingers on her sunglasses, worn even in the darkened room. Oh my dear, by mere association, the only thing you deserve is. Smith-san, Nizu cut in, interrupting the predator who'd been about to devour its prey. Deep down, Haruno knew that her death had somehow just been delayed. Could you perhaps wait until a thorough, and above-board, interrogation is performed? It'd be a shame if we lost a potential link to the terrorist out of turn. The spook looked as if she went through a vicious internal struggle, but in the end, she smiled. It wasn't a nice smile by any means. All right, Agent Smith said, acquiescing to the simple request. The Ravenette left her sunglasses where they were. But only if I get to watch the kid at work this time. Instantly, Haruno understood that she was beyond well and truly fucked. It wasn't fair. The sponsor had been ultra-rich, and willing to give the school so much. Of course she'd accept it immediately. Sure, he'd been a tad eccentric, but the rich usually were. And really, signing checks in English? Why would that have set off any kind of alarm with her? Just what the hell did AFO even mean anyway? UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena? Shoto Todoroki walked into the arena's raised platform, but he didn't hear much of anything as he did. Present Mike had thrown him an extremely flamboyant and outrageously extravagant introduction, and the public had dutifully cheered wildly, but he'd already tuned everything out by then. Really, he didn't even want to hear the words, the titles people placed upon him. All they did was hurt him anyway. The son of Endeavor. As he brooded, the heterochromatic ignored his opponent's shout, the girl yelling at their teacher over some joke regarding her androgynous appearance. Scratch that, hearing her voice definitely brought back his rage. Are you an idiot? Get over yourself already. You're not the only one whose life has been hard. Your stigma now is completely self-manufactured. You want to hear what a really horrible childhood sounds like? They didn't understand. None of them did. Even so, for some reason the words pierced him, flying like arrows straight into his heart. He'd only meant to confront the obstacle that had arisen, the only one who'd managed to get in his way, but instead he'd been attacked. They'd treated him like a pretender, as if his sick joke of a life, years of torture and abuse, meant nothing. Todoroki didn't notice when midnight called the match to start. He only knew that he hated. Kyuka knew she was screwed. Hard. Even if she'd had her gear, even if she'd had the tools Izuku had literally invented just for her, like the sonic gun he'd shown her a diagram of, or the sonic hover boots he'd added last minute to the sketches of her hero suit, there was no realistic way for her to win this fight. Well, fuck it. She might as well go out with a bang. Hi-ya! The punk rocker screamed as loudly as she could, sticking her earjacks into the newly remade concrete flooring. She went for maximum power, pushing everything she had into this one shot, because it would be her only chance. Brurum. The ground didn't shatter before Kyuka, it detonated. The powerful shockwave she'd created surged forth with all the power of desperation, heading straight for Todoroki. When Izuku had helped the group with quirk training, he'd come to her and devised a handful of tactics and skills that used her powers in ways she'd never considered. This plan called for using a weak pulse to first produce a tunnel, and then follow it up by producing a larger pulse. The second was guided via the tunnel and thus focused at the target for a better overall attack. The first vestiges of the sonic attack surged against Todoroki, gravel and small bits of concrete peppering him. It was enough to rouse him from his spiraling introspection. The heterochromatic found himself surrounded by a thin cloud of dust. What had happened? As far as he knew, his opponent wasn't capable of anything more than directing her heartbeat and hearing well. That was all she could do without gear. Right? Ultimately, it didn't matter, because once again, he was being challenged. Him. All I see right now is the spiteful second coming of Endeavor. The memory struck Todoroki at the exact same moment Kyuka burst from the dust cloud right in front of him. The punk rocker was ready to throw a punch, amazed she'd gotten this far and prepared to go down swinging. And then Todoroki's body finally reacted, his mind still tripping itself up. It was just a wave of his hand, nothing more. But for such a small action, the effect was instantaneous. The air around the two combatants chilled, the massive drop in temperature so quick and so great there was no chance to react. That didn't stop the dual-colored teen's anger though. For a split second, he forgot to keep himself in moderation. And from that second to the next, suddenly massive peaks of ice towered over the stands, thankfully jutting out of the stadium's circular opening in the roof. The public at large was left speechless, even pros gobsmacked at the outrageous display of power. Aizawa and Yamada couldn't even comment. What was there to even say? At the side of the combatants' arena, Midnight shivered violently as half her body suffered under a layer of frost. Cementos could barely move his head. Then there was a scream. Kyuka! Jarred out of his stupor, Todoroki looked around and found himself standing in the front row of a horror show. His opponent had been encased in ice, swallowed up by the newborn glacier. Completely. Before he'd always trapped enemies in walls of ice, leaving their heads exposed to the open air so they could at least breathe, if not move. But this? This was a situation right out of one of the bastard's excessive force lawsuits. Todoroki didn't know what to say. What could he say? The heterochromatic stepped forward, raising his right hand as he did so. He could fix this. He hated using that bastard's quirk, but he didn't have a choice now. Get the fuck away from her, you monster! Suddenly, another of Todoroki's classmates landed in front of him, the one with a raven's head he'd seen with Midoriya earlier throughout the festival. While the interloper stood and glared at him, a beast of writhing shadow phased into existence from the avian teen's stomach and wasted no time before diving at the glacier behind them. To Todoroki's surprise, the dark entity was able to slither through the cracks in the ice he hadn't even known were there, reaching his entombed opponent with ease. In no time at all, his raven-headed classmate's quirk, because that's what it had to be, had created a cocoon of darkness around their trapped classmate. Tay! Todoroki snapped to attention, the sound of Midoriya's voice setting his nerves on fire. The dual-haired teen nearly forgot about the situation he'd just caused as he whipped his head around to see his verdant target braced against a railing, pointing intently at him. Break the obstacle. Now! Todoroki felt his heart stop. Boom! Leaping from its place in the stands, Midoriya's black-haired tool flew through the air, arm pulled back in preparation for a haymaker. The son of Endeavor flinched back at the blank-faced fury that was the undead thing coming at him faster than he could react. Trying to gather his wits, the heterochromatic prepared to use his ice again, the prior use slowing him as frost had already shot up his left leg and over his chest. Closer. Closer. Right as Todoroki was about to unleash a lance of ice to intercept the threat to his life, the black-haired tool flew over him. Kaboom! The earth itself shook with the force of the undead's fist colliding with the glacier. The resulting explosion nearly pushed Todoroki off his feet, but instinct took over and a boot of ice kept him locked in place. Twisting around, the dual-haired teen could only watch in place as the now-freed shadow beast rose from the remains of the mountain of ice. Together, the undead and quirk entity marched over to Todoroki's raven-headed classmate. The avian teen gently took his opponent, who he now saw was beginning to turn blue, into his arms. With one last baleful glare from the only human of the trio, the three left the arena. As he stood there, on the field of battle with only the ruins of his mistake for company, Todoroki failed to understand what had just happened. How had everything gone so wrong? He'd been attacked. He'd reacted. He'd overreacted. Why the hell hadn't Midnight-sensei or Cementos-sensei stopped him? And then? UA Sports Festival Stadium, Seating Area A. As one Todoroki stood silently in the middle of the stadium's arena, looking lost and alone, another Todoroki merely scoffed at what he'd just witnessed. Endeavor groused, the number 2 hero unable to hide his utter loathing at the scene. Typical weaklings. What did they expect to happen when they dared to stand against the strong? The flaming man hated it. There was always someone like that goddamn little chit. Fools who threw themselves against power they never had a chance of matching, and then complained when they got hurt. Sparring? Arrests? If it wasn't some upstart pro, unable to recognize when they were outclassed, it was a pissant villain who refused to accept their place as the scum of society. But it wasn't like he really cared about what had just happened, none of it really mattered in the end after all. The girl should have just forfeited the moment she discovered her opponent had been his current masterpiece. The strength of his target's tool had surprised him though. Endeavor knew he'd faced pros and villains alike who'd boasted quirks of super strength or ones able to shut off their wielder's natural limiters for the same result. Somehow, the tool, that undead creature, somehow it seemed closer to the former than the latter. And if his suspicions were correct, that meant his target would be capable of similar feats. Perfect. Gear Wars, thus May fought there, for Hades. In all the ways that mattered to May Hatsum, the sports festival was over. The cheers from before still echoed in her ears and heart though. All that praise, the recognition, it had been intoxicating. It had filled a hole inside her that normally only making more of her babies had before. Honestly, if it wasn't for the fact that the Rosette had been nearly drowning in fear the entire time she'd been facing Birdie, she might have even considered applying for a transfer to the hero course. They got that kind of attention all the freaking time. Ow. May groaned, allowing herself to slump against the cool wall of the exit tunnel. This was supposed to start aching tomorrow. The aches and pains were another reason May kept away from the front lines. It wasn't so much she feared getting hurt as it was she was terrified of the possibility of getting hurt to the point of no longer being able to make her precious babies. Ring. 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 The classic, piercing tone of May's ancient, pre-quirked telephone ringtone cut through the air. The Rosette pulled herself out of her musings to see who'd bothered to call her. She could count on one hand how many people actually had her number. Hello. As was her habit, May greeted the mystery person in poor English. May. Me-yo-yai-yai. Even shrieking in absolute distress as it was, the voice on the other end of the phone call was undeniably cute and feminine. That meant it could only be one person. Geez, what's the problem, Ki-chan? May asked, holding her phone away from her ear and rubbing the abused sensor organ with her other hand. I know the stand didn't catch fire. I would have been able to see it from the field before I left. But it is on fire. Keed shouted back, causing the mad inventor's face to deadpan at the news. No. Not that kind of fire. What? May was at a loss. What could that mean? If there was a fire at a UA sports festival, then there'd be smoke in the air, alarms blaring, panicking people. Keed. Explain. They're fighting over your guns. That information caused the Rosette to sit back and blink. She hadn't brought her blasting babies to her festival exposition. Look, there's a funny-looking guy here surrounded by a bunch of weird girls, and he's asking a lot of questions. I didn't even know you made a bulletproof raincoat. I need you here. Now. To say May was stunned was an understatement. That was another baby she'd left in the lab. What the hell was going on? The only guns she'd made recently, that worked, were those Izuchi had given her the schematics for. Since she'd only built them and given them some minor tweaks, she hadn't felt like she could claim them as hers. The coat sounded familiar as well. Oh. She remembered now. She'd kit-bashed a bunch of failed babies together that had matched Izuchi's needs for the test he'd been helping with. The baby she'd been left with had performed so well it had served as the base for the new hero costume she'd been making for him. But that still didn't explain how either of those two got to her stand. Both should have been secured in a marked box in her corner of Power Loader Sensei's workshop. She'd even put it in the opposite corner from the box's marked exposition, so that none of her babies that weren't ready for their debut would accidentally get mixed in. She'd even written on the box in big, red marker, "Do not move," in English. Did Keed pay attention in English class? Keed! May shouted, popping up abruptly. The mad inventor was suddenly filled with a frantic energy, not even able to feel her aches anymore. Don't move. And don't let anyone walk away with any of my babies. The Rosette wasn't sure what was pumping her with more adrenaline, Nizu demanding her head on a stick for the slip-up, or Izuchi looking at her with disappointment as he ended their friendship over her marketing his babies as her own. Soon after, UA Sports Festival Stadium exterior, pop-up support fair. When she reached her stand, May found the little booth crowded with people. It was chaos. Get your hands off my Soon-T-O-B tech! Shouted a grossly obese man decked out in a clearly expensive business suit. Back away, sir. These are too useful to be allowed into the hands of a greedy bastard. Shouted back a tall and muscular man, his receding hairline doing nothing to diminish his intimidating figure. If the badge on his chest was any indication, he was a member of the police force. Both of you back off. These exquisite pieces belong to the heroes that can pay for them. Countered a man dressed smartly in a fashionable vest, undershirt, and dress pants. His appearance screamed suave representative of a major support company. These belong to the officers that can actually make the arrest. The badged man shouted back. Maybe he was a higher rank then? Oh, you simply must have one of these. It could even stop one of my arrows. That particular scream of delight came from a rather tall, blonde with pointy ears. The young woman was pulling excitedly on the sleeve of, there was the funny-looking guy Keed was talking about. But it needs to be in black. Everything's better in black. The odd support came loudly from a petite girl dressed in gothic Lolita who was pulling on the funny-looking guy's other sleeve. How does this work? Or this? And that? Do you have a manual for this? A younger girl, about May's age, with blue hair, was poking around at, well, pretty much everything. Collapsed against the stand, eyes nearly swirling from all the action, was a petite girl with short, black hair. The poor thing had been unable to keep up with all the people who'd gathered. This had certainly not been what she'd been expecting when she'd offered to help May with her stand. She said offered, but really, she would have been saddled with it anyway. No one else in their class wanted to work with the pink-haired demon after all. Slowing to a walk, May had already had enough. All right, that's it. Back off. The mad inventor roared, the sudden appearance of the woman of the hour stopping the mob cold. These babies aren't for sale. They're too important to me. And my friend. Sliding to the ground, Keed shed tears of happiness. May had called her a friend. In reality, the Rosette hadn't been speaking about the short-haired Ravenette at all. Her thoughts had been on someone a bit more green. Nonsense. If it's here, it's for sale. The obese man chortled, moving far quicker than one of his girth should have been able to. Suddenly he was right in front of May, looming over her like a fat cat drooling at a cup of cream. I'll take the lot, and their patents, for 50,000. Keed's eyes bulged at the amount. That was a lot of money for what amounted to mere school projects. May, however, took the offer as an insult. She'd never sell a single one of her babies for so low, much less one's birthed from a union with Izuchi. No. Deal. The flat declaration caused a collective gasp from all around, even those not directly involved who'd been eavesdropping. What? The fat man was bewildered by this turn of events. He'd expected the usual game, not flat-out denial. Where was the haggling over price? Where was the opportunity to downplay the girl's tech so that she felt like his offers were the only good ones she'd ever get? Sensing his competition getting close to making their own moves, the man acted fast. Fine. 100,000. Keed nearly swooned. The short-haired Ravenette was sure anyone else would have sold the rights then and there. But May? The answer's no. Just turned around and began putting everything that had been strewn about the stand back into the marked box. May's orders had been clear, both from Nizu and Izuchi himself. The principal had said her friend's ideas needed to be studied inside UA's walls where they were safe, and they could be archived under the school's legal protocols. The Verdunette had been even clearer. He didn't want his babies to fall into the hands of anyone not dedicated to peacekeeping. The risk of them being reverse-engineered for lethality was too great. Excuse me, young lady? The funny-looking man approached the now fuming inventor calmly, as if her reactions were an everyday occurrence. He pulled out some sort of identification card. I would like to make you an offer, in the name of our country. That managed to stop May in her tracks. The way the man had worded that had been strange to say the least. Locking onto the card the funny-looking man held out with zoom, the Rosette froze. She wasn't dealing with any old fish in the pond anymore. El Lieutenant? Yuji Itami. May mumbled the words as she read over the card. Her quirk zeroed in on every letter, every condecoration, the seal. Your JSDF. Down on the ground, Keed's jaw didn't have far to drop as it fell open in shock. This was way too much for her. She was a first-year, damn it. How the hell had May caught the attention of the JSDF? Oh, she was going to need a whole day in her game to get over this, she just knew it. That's right, Lieutenant Itami replied with a slight smile and nod. Honestly, I came here today because I was on leave. But after seeing all this? I would like to take a sample of the raincoat if you don't mind, and of a nutrition bar if you had one to spare. May blinked. Indecision flooded the mad inventor as she was presented a choice she'd never expected to have to make. She stood by what she'd said before, these babies weren't just hers to make decisions on, but at the same time, the JSDF wasn't just any buyer. Would Izuchi mind if she agreed? The JSDF was more into relief operations and self-defense, right? But then, weren't these babies a bit extreme for the work they did? I guess that's okay? Sir, May stuttered out, unsure if she was supposed to be overly respectful here or not. But why would you need? Of course, I wouldn't dream of taking these for free, the lieutenant interrupted. I'll talk to my superiors immediately, and propose you receive a lifetime contract. If they see this tech is suitable to our uses, which I know they will, you should be good to go. May could only nod in response. She wasn't following. Had she just made a sale? That quickly? Was that how it worked? Perfect, the lieutenant cheered, clapping his hands once in approval. Keep those sealed away from me, would you? I'll have some of my men come along for them shortly. They'll bring the contract with them for you to sign as well. Oh, okay? May was lost. Had she just signed herself and Izuchi to the JSDF? The lieutenant turned around, business done. Let's go, girls. At the command, the three weird girls he'd come with flocked to the man's side. We've got a lot more to see today. Let's enjoy ourselves before we have to return to base, yeah? As the quartet left to the cheers of the three girls, the ensuing silence sat heavily on those who remained. Well, if that's the case, the large man wearing the badge said, courageously breaking the silence. He took out his phone and began to dial. I'll just have to get the Prime Minister on the line and have him sign for those guns of yours. Rubber bullets are shit against villains today. I'll buy everything else. The obese man cried suddenly, everything. At that point, May shut down all non-essential functions. She was pretty sure she was going to get quite an earful for this, if not from Nizu, then from Izuchi. And honestly, the Rosette wasn't sure which she dreaded facing more. Omake, undying love. What I feel, is no crush. Inside a dark room, a young teen was sleeping the night away. A slight smile on his freckled face denoted just how much the young man had healed from his previously broken state. After all the twists and turns, the low points he'd survived, things were finally starting to look up for him. He'd gotten himself a girlfriend. His mother was healthier than ever. Most of his classmates were decent and treated him like a human being. His principal was emphatically on his side. What I feel is love. Izuku Midoriya had not been the only one whose life had recently taken a turn for the better, however. Those he'd touched, with his heart and his cursed blood, were also experiencing change. And it was all for the better. Saki had recovered her gang, the girls who were a large part of the delinquent's life, finding new hope in the return of their boss. The blonde had driven the girls to properly take care of their new home and respect their new job, and all seemed well there. She'd even gotten justice for her father, the moment cathartic for all involved. Lily, by all accounts, had finally gotten a family that loved her without reservation. She'd finally had her choices about her life recognized and respected, and anyone with eyes could see the littlest zombie was beyond happy with her current situation. And Tay? What you gave me was a purpose. In the darkness of the room, a single figure was standing, pressed up against the edge of Izuku's bed. While Lily cuddled her fluffy unicorn plushie in adorable silence by the window, and Saki lazed in the corner blissfully listening to obscene music through a pair of headphones, Tay simply stood there, lovingly watching her savior. Her master. And after all the love you've given me, this is the least I can do. Normally dead, dull eyes watched on, full of life. Determination and purpose shone brightly as the twin orbs of red shone with a fierce love. Tay wanted, above all else, to see Izuku, her master, happy. She didn't want to take Tsuyu's place. Izuku loved her, but neither did she wish to pose as merely a loving sister. She never wanted to impose on the one who'd given her what everyone else in her old life had refused her. Click. The sound, as infinitesimal as it was, caused the ravenet to glide over to the window, steps sure and smooth. That noise would have been so quiet most people would have never had a hope to hear it. But she had. And there, lodged into the windowsill, was a grappling hook. Opening the window as stealthily as possible, Tay looked down. Clinging to the rope, already halfway to their destination, two figures garbed in black looked up in surprise. Dead eyes stared down, and two widened pairs stared back. The undead ravenet gripped the grappling hook with one hand, and dislodged the multi-pronged piece of metal from its resting place. Lifting the hook, the rope, and the hangers-on away from the window, the zombie girl carried the load as if it weren't any heavier than a trash bag. Dead eyes stared down, and two covered heads rapidly shook in a desperate plea. Without a hint of remorse, with no hesitation, Tay let go of the hook. There were yelps, a shrill scream, and then the sound of a car being crunched under the weight of an object, or objects, hitting it from above. None of the sounds were loud enough to awaken Tay's master. Gracefully, Tay closed the window and returned to her rightful place, keeping vigil over her master. I will protect you, care for you as you did for me. Because I love you, my Izuku. Chapter 29.5, A Sinister Special 2. Deep Scars, for Liruil. Shoyuta Aizawa, the pro-hero codenamed Eraserhead, was having a rather worse day than he'd expected to have. Not only had he been somehow saddled with being Hizashi's co-announcer for the sports festival, but he'd also had to deal with the machinations of the board's more amoral members right from the start. Case in point, he was just now taking a breather after the discovery that the tournament's randomization placement program had been tampered with. And he'd be shocked if it didn't turn out to be one of those meddlesome idiots who'd done it. And once the festival was over, the exhausted man just knew there was going to be terrible backlash when that particular tidbit came to light. At least they didn't fuck with the first match, Aizawa groused absently to himself as he took a small detour to a vending machine he knew had been recently installed in a nearby hallway. He had time, surely Hizashi was capable of opening the first match by himself, right? He needed the caffeine anyway. For whatever that small mercy's worth. Despite the other changes made to the tournament's lineup, his problem child, one Izuku Midoriya, would still be going first. Just mulling over all of the negativity the cinnamon roll of a kid had faced so far in his short life, for all the wrong reasons, was depressing. Honestly, the underground pro wasn't sure what would be worse for his student at this point, losing here at the first round, or advancing further. Is that my favorite Eraserhead I see? The cheery, sing-song voice froze the brooding homeroom teacher in his tracks, the pit of his stomach dropping out just as he was about to push the button on the vending machine for his beverage. God damn it. What a coincidence. Aizawa scowled, back still turned to the new arrival. If she made a point to say that right from the start, that meant only one thing. This wasn't a coincidence at all. Are you stalking me? The underground pro asked the intruder, refusing to turn around and face his fate. Why did it always have to be her, The one woman who would never respect his personal space. The one woman who'd never leave him alone. Don't you have students to keep track of? Joke? Ah, a coworker of mine will take care of them, the pro-heroine codenamed Ms. Joke replied, joviality dropping for a moment as the sea foam-haired woman almost sounded human for a moment. Besides, they're probably at the stands getting junk food and drinks anyway. They don't need me for that. Aizawa grunted at the casual dismissal. He reached out to select his beverage, but paused when his bubbly torturer slid up beside him with a wide grin on her face. It took an ungodly amount of effort for the underground hero to keep from looking at that world-brightening smile. But really, that's not important. Ms. Joke continued, raising her hands up and interlacing her fingers in a faux prayer position. She gave the gruff homeroom teacher a look. This is. Meeting you like this, by complete chance, is clearly fate. Come on, what'd say? You and I show? No. Aizawa snapped, cutting off the comedian before she could finish. He tried returning to the task at hand, of getting his beverage, damn it, but, gods, why did it still have to hurt so much? Even after all these years, why was it so hard to leave the past behind? Oh come on. Ms. Joke playfully bemoaned, collapsing into Eraserhead's side. Even as he knew that this was just one of the woman's gags, from the corner of his eye Aizawa could have sworn he saw an honest, pleading glint in hers. At least let me finish the line. Aizawa grumbled in response, willing his focus away from the woman hanging onto him and back onto the vending machine. He just needed to finish what he was doing, before it was too late. Don't ignore me, Shoyuta, Emi Fukakato whispered, nearly begging. The sea foam-haired pro-heroine leaned into the gruff underground heroes, turning and burying her face into his side. Please. Lightly trailing a gauntlet hand up Shuta's side, Emi realized where she was touching and, after a moment of thought, poked a specific spot on the exhausted man's ribs. More precisely, she poked where an old scar should have been, a tender reminder of their past together. For Aizawa, it was a button that instantly hurled him back through memories and nightmares better left buried and forgotten. In a flash, the underground pro was no longer in the sports festival stadium, but falling down a kaleidoscope-esque infinity of fragmented imagery, jumbled colors, and cacophonous sounds. Blinking furiously against the inevitable onslaught, Aizawa struggled to see through the phantasms, to move a single finger and push a button, any button, on the vending machine. But then the smells hit him. Flashback redacted. Yashona Fayadas, ya hero scum. Everything had gone to shit so fast. Of course, it had to have happened eventually. Two young and brash pros, no matter that one tried to be more mature and keep the duo grounded, would have eventually bit off more than they could have chewed. The world was full of ugly places, and the greenhorns Eraserhead and Ms. Joke had just invited themselves into one. It should have just been their first taste of taking down a pair of big fish. Instead, it had been a lesson in bad decisions, and the consequences they brought. Yeah. Shoulda just taken the civvies and run. Weeday got away and Evryond Ave been happy. The Blade Brothers, a pair of high-level villains who'd spent their time plying their talents on low-level targets like standalone jewelry stores and mom-and-pop businesses. The two men were the worst of the worst, yet somehow kept out of the notice of most pro-heroes in the areas they operated in. Enter Ms. Joke, a rising star on the hero scene, and Eraserhead, her unknown counterpart who kept to the shadows of the underground. After a hard-fought year of trials and tribulations, the unlikely duo had slowly cleaned up the slums of their city, to the point that their agencies had considered reposting them elsewhere. And then the call had come in. The Blade Brothers had taken hostages in their most recent heist. Flashback out present, UA's Sports Festival Stadium, interior hallway system. Emi withdrew slightly, frowning as she realized Shoyuta hadn't made a grunt or rejected her since she'd prodded his old wound. Her dark green eyes widened, the pro-heroine realizing too late that the gruff man was beginning to tremble, his own eyes staring forward yet unfocused. Oh no. Flashback redacted. I think it's time you brats learned a lesson. They'd fucked up. Turned out the brothers had, between them, basically been immune to their quirks. The elder, who'd squared off against Eraserhead, had been a mutant type with tusks of all things growing from his forearms. The ivory additions had been filed to a razor's edge, and said edges had been kept purposefully filthy to ensure any injuries they caused would not only be agonizing but quickly fester and worsen. The younger, who'd immediately faced off against Ms. Joke, had extendable nails that were somehow long, jagged, and sharp all at the same time. For some reason, probably as a result of whatever had given him the large scar that wrapped around his head starting from his ear, across his forehead, to his other ear, the man couldn't laugh. It had been like that part of his brain just hadn't worked. In retrospect, if they'd only swapped opponents, the entire outcome might have been different. But they hadn't. Equals flashback out equals present, UA Sports Festival Stadium, interior hallway system. Emmy bit back a curse. This wasn't what she'd wanted. She'd just wanted some attention, even just a laugh. She'd long since accepted she'd probably never get the yes she'd been aching for, but, damn it, she was an idiot. Equals flashback equals, redacted. It hadn't even really been a fight, more a beatdown with sharp edges. By the time the elder brother had been satisfied with tearing into Eraserhead, the underground hero had been on the cusp of bleeding out. Internally, the damage had been just as severe, as an entire rib had been carved out and taken as a trophy by the older villain. And Ms. Joke? You're lucky I hear the sirens, you piece of shit. If we weren't in a hurry now, I'd let my lil bro take his time with your circus freak over there. He needs some stress relief. Well, seeing him gut, like official just have ta do. Shoulda. Equals flashback END equals present, UA Sports Festival Stadium, interior hallway system. Aizawa gasped, the phantoms of the past dissipating at last. Looking to his side, the underground pro noticed the worried gaze of his old partner. Ka-chink. The vending machine depositing its prize hardly penetrated either pro's awareness as the two continued to stare at each other. Eraser? I have to go, Aizawa blurted, interrupting Ms. Joke while bending down to swipe the acquired beverage from the vending machine. He really did need to get out of there. Now. Let me repay you. Ms. Joke stuttered out, suddenly panicking. It was a desperate shot, she knew that, but she had to try. We could go on a date. No. Aizawa barked, sharply cutting off the distraught heroine. Without another word, the Erasure hero turned and fled, rounding a corner and making his escape. Walking as quickly as he could, the underground pro tried, and failed, to keep his thoughts away from all of the horrible things that had followed that failed mission. That tragedy. Him losing that rib had been nothing compared to what had happened to Emmy, to what could have been. When he'd woken up in that nameless hospital, he'd frantically demanded to know what had happened to his partner. Before he'd succumbed to his injuries, he'd seen her. And her insides that had painted the area around her. He'd been beside himself, worried out of his mind. He'd been able to keep from losing any coworker, friend or not, since his days at UA, but even their Emmy had been special. They'd kept it beyond low-key, but they'd been dating for just over a year at that point. When he'd finally bullied a nurse into giving him the answers he'd been looking for, he'd wished he hadn't. She hadn't said anything to him, but she'd been pregnant at the time. Aizawa had never known if she hadn't known herself, been afraid to tell him, or had just wanted to announce it in some bombastic way befitting her hero persona, but in the end, it hadn't mattered. The baby hadn't survived. To make the nightmare worse, the injuries Emmy had suffered had been deep and far-reaching. Half her cecum had been torn out, and her lower intestine had been shredded as if put through a blender. The worst was yet to come, however. The younger brother's jagged claws had penetrated so deeply, they had left her uterus in tatters. Any chance Emmy had had of becoming pregnant again had gone down to nearly zero. And even if she could have conceived again, her life would have then been put at constant risk for the entire pregnancy, all for a slim 5% chance of being able to carry to term. The two of them had been devastated. Emmy had cried and been a mess for months, straight through her entire recovery period. And he'd been a coward, too afraid to approach her and talk about their future together. At the time, the only thing he'd known to do was one thing. Hunt down the bastards that had taken their future from them. Aizawa stopped, realizing he'd been aimlessly marching through the halls of the stadium. He needed to get back to the box before Hisashi said or did something stupid. But, he really needed a moment to rein in his emotions more. Once again, memories assaulted the underground pro. Having learned the extent of the brothers' abilities, and no longer in the mood to play by the rules of law, it hadn't taken Aizawa long to catch the two villains. In fact, it had taken longer for him to leave them tied up hanging from a 5-story building, after beating them nearly to death and breaking every bone of theirs he could. While he'd stopped short of killing the Blade brothers, it had still been an unsanctioned operation that had smacked of vengeance instead of justice. Aizawa had been faced with a mark against his license, and it would have been the end of his career if Interpol hadn't stepped in. The international organization had spoken up on his behalf to the Hero Association, proposing he take time away from the Japanese hero scene while joining their own division of lawkeepers. The Jaegers? Aizawa took a sip of whatever beverage he'd ended up getting from the vending machine. Eck. Sweet. The gruff man normally avoided sweet things, they reminded him too much of the woman he'd just escaped, the one his own ineptitudes and hubris had left mutilated. That line of thinking led the underground pro to thoughts on another poor soul who'd suffered because of his failures, a certain nascent necromancer. If his Midoriya weren't able to heal the most grievous of injuries like he could. The thought still gave the normally stoic man shivers. It was too bad his student's quirk couldn't heal older, more severe. Aizawa felt the breath leave his lungs as he touched his side, feeling for the missing rib that was his physical reminder of past failures. It wasn't there. Or more accurately, the rib was no longer missing, it was there. But the doctors had been clear, regrowing bones from nothing was next to impossible. Short of finding a person with a specific quirk that allowed for bone manipulation in others, nothing in the medical world's current arsenal could have repaired his injury. It had been a trait shared by Emi's scarred uterus, something neither of them could ever recover. Suddenly, a drop of hope rippled through Shoyuta Aizawa's soul. If Izuku had somehow given him his rib back. Could he? Could Emi's? Erase her head. Do you copy? The sound of Namuri's voice coming through his communication bead, in full midnight persona, snapped Aizawa's back to reality. Erase her head here, the underground pro replied, internally compartmentalizing his last train of thought for later. He couldn't afford for the possibility of a ray of hope to mar his performance here. Did something happen? The gruff man called it a ray of hope, but if he were honest with himself, it now burned at his insides as if he were trying to hold the sun in his chest. Oh, nothing much. Midnight drawled, causing Eraserhead to frown, just Mike calling your problem child a monster on air. Aizawa didn't bother to respond or ask for more information. Problem child or not, budding necromancer or not, Izuku Midoriya was still a hero in training and a student of UA. His student. He knew Hisashi had his reasons for disliking those with so-called dark quirks, but that was sure as hell no excuse to go after kids. Trying to make amends. In the bowls of UA's Sports Festival Stadium, inside one of the many rooms dedicated to allowing participants a space to rest and focus, a pair of longtime friends could be found sitting across from each other. Eijiro Kirishima and Mina Ashido had known each other for what seemed like forever, even before their quirks had come in, and in that expansive stretch of time, nothing had come between the two quite like this. In her chair, Mina sat silently, curled into herself as she pouted fiercely. The pink-hued girl was visibly trembling, and it was clear to anyone who knew her, like Eijiro did, that she was a hair's trigger away from lashing out. The redhead himself, though, was in no hurry to draw the ire of the girl across from him again. Already, he was sporting a swollen eye and glowing red handprints all along his face, chest, and arms. Instead, the manliest man of Class 1A held an expression of deep shame upon his face as he looked down at the floor. This was all his fault, Eijiro had concluded. Their fun had crossed the line because he'd been an idiot, and now Mina, his best and oldest friend, hated him. He'd spent the last who knew how long thinking about it, hard, but the hardening user couldn't come up with any way of making up for his mistake, for what he'd done to her. But he had to keep trying. He was a man, and a man didn't run away in a situation like this. Mina. Eijiro whispered, standing up and hesitantly shuffling closer to the pinkette. I'm so. Don't. Mina bit out, interrupting the redhead mid-apology without even looking up at his face. Don't you dare say it. The manliest man of Class 1A grit his teeth against the groan that threatened to rise up from him, knowing that wouldn't solve anything. He also now knew that Mina was still in the midst of a moment of righteous feminine fury, and while he would never dream of begrudging the emotions she was feeling right now, he still had no clue on how to deal with them or help her. He'd given her the clothes that he'd left in his locker from before he'd changed into his PE uniform, which she was now wearing. He'd gone and bought her the brands of juice and sour snacks that she loved, which she'd grumpily drank and eaten. And as he could still feel and see on his skin, he'd even let her smack him around until she'd hopefully felt better. The only thing he apparently wasn't allowed to do, to his frustration, was actually apologize and say how sorry he was. Mina. Eijiro said again, more firmly this time but just as pleading. As understanding as he wanted to be, the redhead had just about reached his limit. He refused to lose his best friend over this, not after everything they'd been through together. What can I do? I'll do anything at all. Please. Finally, Mina looked up and locked eyes with the remorseful and begging boy who'd shuffled so closely to her. Golden pools of black caught natural crimson in fields of bloodshot white. No matter how closely he looked, Eijiro couldn't find the hidden mischief he'd always loved to see. Did you see them? The blurted question threw the redhead for a loop, but Mina's hard, unblinking gaze was proof enough she was being serious. Eijiro felt his mind stutter, freezing for what felt like an entire minute as his natural chivalrousness stalled his thoughts in understanding what he'd just been asked. With each passing second of silence, the hardening user could see his inability to answer was causing Mina to grow angrier and angrier. Then, finally, it dawned on him. He knew what this was about. His best friend was worried that he'd seen her naked upper body. Mina, no. Don't worry. Eijiro said quickly, nearly stumbling over himself. He scratched the back of his head, butterflies from his stomach causing him to feel nervous all of a sudden. I didn't see anything. I swear. Instead of the relief he'd expected to see, the manliest man of Class 1A saw Mina only pout harder than ever. The glare alone was enough to cause him to flinch back. But it was the truth. He hadn't seen anything. By the time he'd turned to see what the problem was, Mina had already covered herself with her arms and had started running out of the arena. Honestly, the redhead could, without a shadow of a doubt, say he hadn't seen Mina's naked chest since they were little kids playing around in the bath together. And everyone knew that that didn't count. Right? Suddenly, Mina jumped to her feet, nearly headbutting Ijiro before leaning into his personal space, eyes blazing. Everyone saw them. The Pinkette murmured, enraged, everyone, except you. As if he hadn't been feeling bad enough. Now Ijiro realized just how badly he'd truly fucked this whole thing up. It didn't matter if he hadn't seen anything. The sports festival was broadcast internationally. With one mistake, he'd basically forced his best friend to flash the whole world against her will. What a piece of shit he was. Ijiro trailed off, unable to continue. His heart was hurting worse now. It ached to fix this mess and make Mina feel better. But Mina once again interrupted the redhead. Then look at them now, Kiri. Closing her eyes in a fruitless attempt to lessen her embarrassment, the pink-hued girl lifted her borrowed shirt up as high as it would go. There. She'd done it. She'd finally given the boy in front of her a full, unimpeded view of her breasts. Was she still pissed that basically anyone with a TV had seen them first? Hell yes she was. Did that mean she didn't want the redhead she'd shared so much with to see the same, on her own terms, any less? Hell no. Mina expected a lot of things to come from her rash decision, shouting. Kiri stumbling back into a chair in shock, maybe a little grope if she were honest with herself. But silence? Oh fuck, did he not find her attractive? Had she worked up the nerve to do that for nothing? Thud. Snapping her eyes open at the loud noise, the slightly panicking Pinkette was greeted with a humorous sight. Ijiro had fallen to the floor, unconscious, with a massive nosebleed. You idiot. Even as she crossly muttered the words, a gentle, loving smile softened Mina's face. She was going to make sure Kiri never forgot what happened between them today. By sundown the Pinkette swore to herself she'd have finally caught this boy, the prey she'd been hunting since she was a little girl who'd become enamored with the loud little boy who hadn't cared about her freaky appearance when her quirk had come in. Tsuyu wasn't the only one who'd be claiming a boyfriend this year. Not by a long shot. Chapter 30. A Sinister Understanding. Shoto Todoroki, the son of Endeavor, knew beyond a shadow of a doubt he was in trouble. While the rest of the remaining competitors that were advancing to the next round of the festival's tournament had been guided to their own personal waiting rooms, he'd been singled out and taken to a different part of the stadium's labyrinthine sub-area. Now here he was, facing the principal of UA himself sitting in a large, imposing chair, flanked by members of the board at their own seated positions. For once, Todoroki understood exactly why the bastard always had his lawyers ready and on call. Todoroki-san. Nizu began, the quirked animal's voice, normally so amicable toward a student, now held an uncharacteristic seriousness to it. The tone alone caused the addressed student to shiver. I trust you realize the magnitude of your actions. Right off the bat, Todoroki realized he'd been asked a trap question. Years of watching the bastard's interviews came flooding back to the front of the heterochromatic's thoughts all at once. In all that time, that man had never once acknowledged the true gravity of his actions, most likely because doing so would have obviously placed his career at risk no matter how he'd respond. Answering affirmatively would have indicated malicious forethought while denial assured a one-way ticket to a mental institution for a slew of evaluations and, worse, a hold placed on his license. But, for all his bullshit, the bastard had at the very least conceded that his actions had consequences. I'm sorry, Todoroki replied, keeping his gaze firmly planted on his shoes while at the same time holding his voice firm and low. He would acknowledge the situation his actions had caused. I overreacted. I went too far when striking back and I apologize. The words hurt too much to continue, his tongue in searing agony as if doused in alcohol after being cut by razor blades. He had just, God damn it, he just said the exact same words the bastard, his father, used whenever he found himself cornered by his actions. Verbatim. He swallowed hard, and the acid in his mouth sunk to bubble and roil in his stomach. This is a far more delicate situation than a simple apology can hope to cover, young man, a board member rumbled out with a heavy voice, the placard declaring, public relations the elderly man's only descriptive factor. Your actions nearly cost another student her life. And that's not even taking into account that your tantrum even struck 2 of our teaching staff as well. Todoroki had the decency to wince at that. When the security bots had grabbed him, their quirk-suppressant clamps snapping into place around his biceps, he'd briefly been able to look around before they'd hauled him away and had seen for himself the unintended effects of his mistake. Samantha-sensei and Midnight-sensei, the two pro-heroes in charge of keeping students from going too far, they'd both been partially frozen. And it had been all his fault. While we are thankful that Midnight and Samantha suffered no lasting wounds or otherwise hazardous effects to their health, the same cannot be said for your opponent, Kyukajiro, a horned woman, whose placard read "Finances," continued. Had Izuku Midoriya and Fumikage Tokoyami not been there to act, it is doubtful even our illustrious recovery girl would have been able to prevent, at the very least, a loss of some degree to the girl's extremities. It might have been merely a few of her fingers, or as bad as an entire limb, but regardless the fact remains you attacked with your full force. Todoroki hunched forward, growing even further ashamed of himself as his mistake was read out plainly. The bastard had been in situations like this countless times before, each and every time escaping punishment by citing some contrived law or calling on his lawyers when that wasn't an option. At his worst, he'd even leaned into the supposed stupidity of any fool who dared oppose him while expecting not to get hurt for the insult. The heterochromatic boy knew he could have done the same here. He could have stood there and thrown all the blame on his classmate for being unprepared for his counterattack when she should have known of his power by now. He could have cited his earlier efforts in the battle trials and the USJ, how he'd shown how outmatched she'd been were long before they'd ended up in the arena together. But he just couldn't. He wasn't him. He refused to act like him. "I'm sorry," Todoroki repeated, unable to think of anything different to say. What else could he say? Once again, Midoriya had saved the day. Once again, he'd been left to play the fool. His pride was in tatters. He, the son of Endeavor, the pride of the number 2 hero, titles he'd always loathed. What had he done since entering UA? He might have helped All Might himself get out of a tough spot during the USJ attack, but it had been Midoriya, a nobody with a dark quirk befitting a villain, who'd taken down the monster engineered to kill the number 1 hero. The very same monster the best of the best had struggled with. And after that? He, the strongest of Class 1A, had been sent to therapy while a renowned detective had selected Midoriya for special training. The necromancer had even interviewed with an agent of Interpol. When the bastard had gotten wind of that, he'd gone on and on about it. And now he, the child born and bred for glory, had stood there like a villain while the nobody, the mutant, the monster had taken another bite of the glory of true heroism. Two actually, if he'd overheard the board members correctly before he'd entered the room. Regardless of how sinister Midoriya's quirk was, the necromancer had once again used his blood, this time to heal their classmate of her injuries. Todoroki-san, as you've already been told, this situation isn't one you can apologize your way out of, Nizu spoke up again, two other board members sitting across from those who'd already spoken flinching as the quirked animal scowled. Under normal circumstances, this incident would have been sufficient to end your participation in the festival entirely. However, we find ourselves in abnormal circumstances. As he trailed off, Nizu full-on glared at various members of the board, even at the empty chair with the placard labeled "Security" sitting forlornly in front of it. There was a moment of protracted silence as each victim of the principal's vicious stare cringed back as they were subjected to it. While Haruno's meddling had been disastrous in a nearly catastrophic way, others of the board hadn't had the presence of mind to not add fuel to the pyre when they discovered what she'd done. Indeed, Agent Smith, along with his own investigations, had uncovered that Endeavor had paid quite a hefty sum to various board members behind his back as well. The unscrupulous hero hadn't made any petitions too outrageous, on the surface, but the fact they'd been accepted at all made the quirked animal's blood boil. At least the discovery had uncovered the origin of the handicap placed on students who'd otherwise have been able to freely use their previously cleared support gear. Not to mention the source of their current conundrum as well. Fortunately, the principal of UA knew he still maintained the power of having the last word when it came to who attended his school. "You are hereby presented with 2 options," Nizu declared, delivering the sentence with none of his usual amicability. The seriousness caused the heterochromatic teen before him to tense. "You may choose to drop out of the tournament right now of your own volition while offering a public apology for your actions. It wouldn't free you of any of the legal repercussions of your accidental outburst, however. The Jiros would still be perfectly within their own rights to press charges, of course. Your actions far exceeded the limits of the waivers parents of our incoming students sign after all." The hairs on the back of Todoroki's neck stood on end. It would be a wise choice to take, even without hearing any other option. He'd be showing goodwill to the public, his humanity, not to mention solidifying to himself his intention of walking a path different from the bastards. It might even lessen the backlash amongst his classmates. But his pride demanded he face Midoriya. He would show the necromancer, and the world, that the power gifted to him by his mother was greater than that which the bastard had cursed him with. Your only other option is to continue after taking a verbal and written oath that no further mishaps will occur, Nizu continued, easily catching the hopeful glint in his troubled student's eye before the teen managed to control himself. The quirked animal was more than ready to brutally stab at that hope before it caught into something dangerous. However, know this, Todoroki-san. Should you fail to show restraint, should you grievously harm another student in a failure to exercise self-control, you will be expelled immediately. I trust there's no need to explain what that course of action would entail, do I? Of course there wasn't. In the recorded history of Japan since the establishment of UA, and later other hero schools, had not an expelled student from the country's first institution for producing heroes for violent actions or injuring fellow students ever been accepted by the Hero Association as a pro-hero. It was just as bad, and permanent, as being officially blacklisted. Instead of waiting for him to make his choice, Todoroki was waved away by Nizu. As the heterochromatic teen left the room, presumably to be guided to his own waiting room, the unspoken had been made perfectly clear. He had until his next match to make his decision. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena? Nearly an hour had passed since the final battle of the first round of the third event and the remaining competitors had been led away. Thankfully for UA, the public had mistaken the extended time required to settle its issues in private as the time required to repair the arena after all the damage it had suffered. That ignorance was a leading reason most every member of the audience in the stands were still in high spirits, why they were still so fired up for the next battles coming up. The battles that were going to have to start any minute now. For one Izuku Midoriya, this was just the next step in his day. The match he was about to begin would be much more difficult than need be thanks to the lack of ranged options on his side, but he'd deal with it as best he could. Don't worry boss, Saki reassured as she flexed, pulling on the fabric of her red tracksuit with white highlights so her noticeable arm musculature could be noticed. The blonde was more than ready for a fight. This cunt doesn't stand a chance against the two of us. Dealing with the prospect of controlling Saki's lust for battle as well as an opponent coming for his head? That actually worried the Verdunette a little bit. For one Ibara Shiozaki, the pious teen with vines for hair was grateful to the Lord for finally giving her the opportunity she'd long been waiting for. She was finally being allowed to confront the monster of UA face to face. The time has finally come, Shiozaki murmured as she finished one last prayer, standing just out of sight within the exit tunnel to the arena. Now we will meet in sanctioned combat and I'll finally be able to set you straight. The vine-haired teen had, since her last confrontation with the Verdunette, come to terms with a hard-to-swallow truth she'd struggled to accept. Izuku Midoriya was not, in fact, the devil. The Prince of Darkness would have never come to the aid of All Might, even if it had been to maintain his cover in the mortal world. He wouldn't have thrown himself in front of that judge either, especially when his survival wasn't assured beforehand. Such a wicked being would have been unable to risk itself to help anyone period. Midoriya had shown himself more than willing to do so on far too many occasions to be ignored. Even so, Shiozaki found herself still unable to see the Verdunette as an agent of good. Therefore, after lengthy reflection and prayer, the answer had come to her as to the true nature of the being who'd taken the name Midoriya. He was no demon-born evil, but instead, surely one of the fallen, an angel who'd been led into temptation and now, through a twist of fate, sought redemption. To be accepted back into heaven, to seek to return to the loving embrace of the Holy Father, it was a vision the pious teen would love to help realize. The problem was that Midoriya's nature as a fallen angel kept raising its ugly head. The foul art of necromancy, a perversion of nature itself, probably felt like second nature to a member of the fallen. No wonder the Verdunette didn't see his sins as the truly evil acts they were. But she was going to help him. She was going to make him understand that he needed to cease his current path if he ever hoped to reach salvation. That's why, before she'd left her waiting room, she'd doused her hair, every vine, in holy water. A subtle green light blinked on in both exit tunnels, and with calming breaths, both Izuku and Shiozaki began to walk toward the arena. Those sitting in the stands of the stadium grew quiet, the Jumbotron screens having flickered from their running ads to images of UA's emblem. It's that time, folks. The second round of the first-year sports festival tournament is here. Yeah. It was time. From the southwest gate, after making short work of her last opponent, the priestess of Class 1B herself returns to prove the strength of her faith. It's Ibara Shiozaki. The pious teen stepped into the light of the field and walked to the raised arena without so much as a single wave to the surrounding audience. Honestly, Shiozaki was of the opinion that this battle shouldn't have been made a public spectacle. The act of bringing one to salvation was not meant to be a means of entertainment. In fact, the vine-haired heroine in training decided then and there that she'd abandon this foolish competition once she'd completed her mission. And from the northeast gate, after utterly crushing the hopes and dreams of his opponent, it's he who roars in the face of impossible odds. It's Izuku Midoriya. The stands grew quiet. Many watching were attempting to figure out how things would go crazy this time. In the first match of the day, they'd witnessed one of the monster of UA's abominations, the brain-dead one, in action. This time, the mutant had chosen to bring a different creation. And it was clear to all who watched that this one could think and act on its own. Izuku stepped up into the arena to a nearly silent stadium. Murmurs abound, but the Emerald Necromancer paid them no mind. His desire to receive a warm welcome and cheering had long since died. Instead, he'd take his glory from doing his job and saving people, damn the opinion of the uneducated and bigoted to hell. And by his side, it's the Spitfire of Kyushu. She's the undead leader of her very own biker gang and a wild beauty that will literally bite off your don't you dare. It's Saki Nikaido. The stadium might have been as silent as a grave at her introduction, but Saki could have sworn she heard her entire gang cheering her on from their beach, Reiko especially. That didn't stop the blonde from flipping the loudmouth pro, screaming his head off the bird. "Fuck off, you pervy loudmouth fuck," Saki screamed, raising her middle finger toward the announcer's booth. "Don't think that shitty glassbox will keep you safe." Shiozaki sent a reprimanding glare at Izuku, but the unrepentant necromancer refused to even act apologetic. As a longtime viewer of UA's sports festivals, the Verdinet knew for a fact that Present Mike had been rather aggressive this year. He deserved the flack. Midnight sighed from her position beside the arena. Of course she'd read the reports of the past interactions between these two students, and she had to say, she was rather wary of letting this match go. Had it been up to her, she'd have been hard-pressed not to just call off the entire thing right then. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to begin the second round," Midnight declared, pushing as much false enthusiasm as she could into her words. She was still annoyed that she could imagine that most of the cheering she could hear was being given by those who wished to see a certain Verdinet fall. "Now remember the rules, you two, and that you're both heroes in training. Begin." As Izuku had predicted, Shiozaki wasted no time in making the first move. It just wasn't exactly what he'd thought it'd be. "Izuku Midoriya," the vine-haired teen shouted at the top of her lungs, stepping forward, "I apologize for calling you the devil, for decrying your actions as pure evil out of turn." While admittedly stunned that one of his more vocal, and pious, detractors was actually apologizing to him, Izuku had enough presence of mind to keep his attention focused on said opponent even as she loudly declared her regret with what sounded like heartfelt honesty. Fortunately for him, that meant he was able to catch the advancing vines that were even now extending out from the approaching girl and writhing their way toward him. Looks like guilty conscience or not, Shiozaki intended to fight with her all. "Saki," Izuku murmured discreetly, easily tapping the bond he shared with the blonde. "I gotcha, boss," Saki replied without looking away from her target, a savage grin spreading across her face. Shiozaki placed her hands together in typical prayer position, interlocking her fingers as she halved the distance that had originally separated her from her opponent. "But even so, there is still evil in you." The pious heroine in training continued, not breaking stride, "Today I will help you to start anew. Together we will purify first your body and then the bodies of those you've wronged." And before UA's resident Christian could continue the declaration of her personal crusade, before she could switch to charging at the necromancer while her vines slithered behind him to box him in, she herself suffered the first attack of the match. "So what? You offering your withered fucking rosebush to the boss?" The shout roared far louder from Saki's lips than Shiozaki could have ever hoped to match, easily overpowered the pious girl's words. "Shit, even from here I can tell you're just a lost little virgin looking for the strongest dick to sit on," Saki continued, feral grin plain to see. "What a fucking hypocrite. You know, I bet you're keeping your hands together like that cause you're afraid you'll start stripping right here in the open. You're so desperate for the boss's fuck stick. Am I right?" Shiozaki tripped, her feet nearly stumbling over themselves and her tongue tied itself into knots at the unexpected assault. She sputtered loudly, her mind blanking at the sheer vulgarity thrown at it. Pure shock had frozen her stiff. Her entire life, Shiozaki had grown up valuing her chastity, taught from childhood it was a gift only to be given to her husband on her wedding night. She'd been raised sheltered, she knew that, shielded from all of the lascivious and sinful knowledge readily accessible in certain books and openly on the internet. And she knew that there would be those who didn't understand her morals and might even disagree with her stance on certain issues entirely. But this? In less than a minute, she'd basically been called a slut, a whore, and had had her purity not just questioned, but belittled. Worse, even now Shiozaki could feel the shameless words infecting her soul, corrupting that same purity. Sinful images of a large figure, silhouetted in deep shadow, standing over her imposingly fluttered through her mind's eye. Only the glare off a pair of glasses offered any insight as to the identity of the mysterious figure, revealing an orphan collar as a beastly huff resounding in her head. Shiozaki snapped out of the phantasm, but it was too late. Embarrassed and ashamed, the pious girl blushed hotly as she was forced to clench her thighs together as her hormones raged within her in sudden freedom. SSS, shut up. You evil little. Shiozaki struggled to fight back, verbally or physically. Even thinking on what words would be adequate to hurl back at the blonde delinquent made her blush deepen. Finally, she settled on one. Pervert. Ha! Saki instantly shot back, exacerbating the situation. She was smelling blood in the water, but really, the uptight bitch made it too easy. Don't give me that shit. You know your mommy opened her fucking legs to get you in and out, right? Are you gonna call her a pervert too? Unable to face the words being spewed at her, Shiozaki covered her ears and began to shake her head frantically. Had anyone been close enough to the panicking heroine in training, they'd have been able to hear her repeating some unintelligible mantra as if her life depended on it. Regardless, this gave Saki the opening she'd needed to cover the remaining distance between her and the Vine bitch on her terms. Why don't we fucking check and see if that pretty body of yours is as pure as you say it is? The blonde's words instantly broke through Shiozaki's hysteria. You know, I bet. You're already wet. Suddenly, thorny Vine snapped up and wrapped around Saki's wrist, biting deep. The resulting struggle was ferocious enough that even those far away in the stands or watching from broadcasts were able to take notice. Undead muscle strained against the fortitude of nature. The epic battle was lessened only if one took notice of Shiozaki's face. The pious girl's face flushed red as she attempted to cover herself in obvious fright. Get away from me! Shiozaki screamed, truly and honestly fearing for her maidenhood. She couldn't allow this abomination to defile her. You freak, pervert, Harl, ugh. Wham! The vine-haired teen's frantic words were interrupted by a punch to the face, courtesy of Izuku. The Verdunette had used the distraction to maximum effect, keeping himself just outside of his opponent's range of vision and getting closer only when he was sure her attention had been entirely focused on Saki. Seeing Shiozaki ragdoll backward after his strike was a clear sign his plan had been a success. Oh man. That can't be legal, can it? Present Mick's sudden outburst resonated with the now wincing audience at large, many amongst the crowd seeing the match's development as having turned savage. The undead abomination's verbal assault on the heroine in training had been bad enough, but witnessing the monster of UA outright deck the poor girl in the face? It was horrible to watch, never mind that only a match or two ago they'd been applauding such brutal tactics from other competitors. Forcefully keeping herself at her post, Midnight internally seethed as she nearly reached her boiling point. She loathed when people would pull out some kind of outdated code of chivalry from ages past only when it suited their tastes. Why hadn't they reacted like this during Ishido's match? Why had Jiro getting frozen solid not resulted in them calling for Todoroki to receive some sort of punishment? It was infuriating. Hadn't countless generations of women given their blood, sweat, and tears, literally in many cases, to be considered true equals in all levels of society? In the age since quirks began to manifest and villains had begun to appear, hadn't heroines risen up to fight for what was right just as heroes had? Were these idiots going to just forget that all but the rarest of villains gave absolutely fuck all if their victims were women? Were they going to ignore the statistics of what happened to heroines caught unaware or defeated by said villains? Midnight wouldn't let them. She refused to allow any backsliding to happen if she could help it. As much as she hated doing them, maybe she'd have to accept one of those talk show interviews again soon. Psychological warfare, misdirection, intimidation, outmaneuvering your opponent, these are all valid tactics accepted and approved by every variation of the hero's code the world over. Ibara Shiozaki's quirk gives her the potential to physically defeat and restrain multiple targets at once with ease. In the face of that, Midoriya is using every tool at his disposal to even the odds. If his inability to fit into your ideal visions of the gallant hero offends you, feel free to reprimand him when returns from a hostage situation with your still-breathing children in hand. Eraserhead's stark delivery was like a slap in the face for many of the festival's watchers. Most of the civilians cringed as they realized they were being chastised for how easy it was for them to criticize heroes for how they looked or acted while ignoring their actual deeds. For the pros, the words were like a punch in the gut. Far too many of them could recall failed missions where they'd insisted on being flashy or honorable instead of getting the job done. Back in the arena, Izuku had accepted that Shiozaki wasn't going to forfeit, or pass out, from his punch or her hyperventilation. The vine-haired teen seemed stronger now than she had during the Class 1B test, which meant he'd have to hit her harder, faster, before she decided to make proper use of her quirk. The Verdunette nodded silently to Saki to prepare for what came next. In the time it took to do so, Shiozaki scrambled to her feet, just catching the exchange between necromancer and defiled corpse. Enough! Shiozaki's scream was accompanied by her hair coming alive like a hydra, erupting from her scalp and splitting into uncountable strands of thorny vines. The writhing plant life lashed about wildly, seeming to both protect its mother source as well as attack the approaching invaders. Despite their best efforts, Izuku and Saki were unable to avoid being caught. "Hey!" Izuku shouted as he struggled against the vines constricting him, flinching as their thorns began to dig into his skin. "Moderation please. Didn't Vlad-sensei teach you moderation? Goddamn fucking cunt." Saki screamed, utterly enraged as multiple vines manhandled her like a doll. The blonde might not have been able to feel pain, but she sure as hell noticed that the accompanying thorns were hurting her boss. "I'm going to shove all these fucking weeds right up your..." Silence. The screaming contest between Shiozaki and her delinquent adversary ended with a particularly thorny vine gagging the rebellious walking corpse. The pious teen had had enough, her pride had been wounded, her mind had been corrupted, and even her body had been set upon now. This couldn't be allowed to stand. "Oi!" Izuku shouted, seeing blood spill out from around the vine-gagging Saki and realizing that Shiozaki had lost herself to her rage. "Why are you so angry? A win's a win, but don't." "No. I refuse to listen to you anymore." Shiozaki interrupted, still screaming furiously. "Now you're going to listen to me." That actually gave Izuku pause. Not enough to really stop struggling to get free, but it did make him freeze for a second. Women could be scary. And now the thorns were really digging into him and drawing blood? Ouch. "I know you desire redemption, Midoriya-san." Shiozaki growled, calming only slightly as she turned to face the trapped Verdunette. "But you need to release this foul necromancy you've conjured. Regardless of your intentions, it's an act of perversion against nature, and I can see you're trying to be good. Oh my folks. It's another turn. Here I thought UA's resident necromancer had proved himself nigh unstoppable." If he could have spared a moment, Izuku would have snorted derisively at present Mick's comment. He'd never seen himself as unstoppable. In all honesty, he'd always considered himself more on the frail side. If it wasn't for his regeneration, he knew he'd be a complete mess by now, if not straight up dead. He'd also never seen himself actually winning the sports festival. No matter how he'd looked at it, without his gear, he'd always thought most other students would have had a better chance than him, especially in combat. There's no such thing as an unstoppable hero or villain. Strengths and weaknesses are what we all exploit in order to ensure victory in battle. Although it is true that sometimes the odds can be stacked against us too heavily to surmount, we're only human after all. That's why there are hero schools in the first place. We're here to teach our students how to scale those mountains. As the vines grew tighter, Izuku accepted that he was probably going to lose this match, and honestly he didn't mind losing to the religious Class 1B member. He hadn't capitalized properly on his advantages, and she had. Defeat in those circumstances was nothing to be ashamed of. But, the way she was talking? Foul necromancy? Even after all this time, his girls were still not seen as people. It made his blood boil. Who were these assholes to deny them agency, to ignore the fact they could think for themselves and had their own feelings and goals? How could they act like that and still call him the monster? Izuku's heartbeat quickened, then deadened. "What is thy desire?" "I understand, truly I do," Shiozaki continued, calming the longer she spoke. Unfortunately, as the heroine in training's rage bled away, it was replaced by the tinge of unhinged fervor. "You want so badly to be a hero, but temptation is everywhere. You want to do good, but your nature is fighting you every step of the way. That's why you need to release the dead you've enslaved. Let me help you." Suddenly, Saki's neck made a sickening popping sound as a vine wrapped around it and squeezed, the delinquent instantly going slack. The vines around the blonde tightened further, clearly intent on carrying out the pious teen's mission. Izuku tensed. He needed to stop Shiozaki. Now. He had to. Then. Do. So. "I'll start by putting this soul to rest for you. You've obviously grown too attached," Shiozaki shouted, turning her full attention to Saki's limp form. The heroine in training raised her hands, ready to utterly destroy the tainted corpse that shackled the vulgar blonde's poor soul to the mortal plane. Too late, Midnight realized just how serious the vine-haired teen was in ending the crimes against nature as she saw the zombie girls. "Shiozaki, if you go any further..." Then, they heard it. Midnight's words died in her throat as she felt something she'd only felt once before, years ago after she'd tried to console Shurikuen after what had happened to him and Emi-chan. It wasn't a paralyzing aura of fear. It wasn't even a crushing weight of killing intent. If she'd had to name it, the pro-heroine would have simply said, "It felt like death." Stop. A single word. That was all. A single word, not even screamed or spoken in a raised tone. That was all Midoriya said. Some undeniable force caused Shiozaki to turn back to her opponent, to obey that command. The sight that greeted her froze her stiff, every instinct shrieking in a million different directions. Midoriya, it wasn't the Verdunette that stared back at her. A blazing crimson stare met her head-on, held on a face that was, much to the pious teen's confusion, devoid of anger. Before her very eyes, Shiozaki watched as the vines she'd had restraining the necromancer suddenly withered and died. Now free, the Verdunette then began to approach. "Stay where you are." Shiozaki stammered out, reflexively attempting to regain control of the situation. She sent more vines out to recapture her opponent, having belatedly realized he was the greater source of danger present. Unfortunately for her, the result was the same, every single vine withered and died as soon as it touched Midoriya. The dark creature continued its advance unhindered. "You will not harm her," Izuku stated, unstoppable. "I will not allow it." Feeling her fervor cool in the face of this thing coming toward her, Shiozaki threw all of her remaining vines at it, even dropping the defiled corpse she'd been about to purify to do so. Their fate was the same as all the others, turning to dust the moment they came into contact with the approaching Verdunette with glowing eyes. "I am possible," Shiozaki mumbled, stepping back as she failed to comprehend how this was happening. "I doused my hair in holy water. Nothing infernal should be able." That's when it hit her. The truth. All this time, Shiozaki hadn't been facing a necromancer, or a demon, or even a fallen angel. Any one of those beings would have been held back by her prayers, affected by her holy water, or succumbed to the sanctity of her crusade. No spawn of hell, servant of darkness, or lost spirit would have been able to stand against her and her ironclad faith. For Midoriya to still be unaffected by all of that, nay even offended at having it used against him, could only mean one thing. As these thoughts raced through the vine-haired teen's mind, Izuku had reached his opponent without further issue. Despite being fairly close in height, the pious teen felt as if she were in the presence of a titan looking down at her. It was clear to Shiozaki now. Izuku Midoriya hadn't been affected by any of her divine interventions for one simple reason, and it had to be that reason because any other scenario was simply impossible or absurd at this point. How could she have missed it? Izuku Midoriya was an angel, a member of the heavenly host itself. That meant that she'd been toiling against an envoy of God himself, impeding the work of his will. This was an even bigger failure on her part than her performance during the faux villain test all those weeks ago. Shiozaki tried to apologize for her sin, the revelation nearly frying her brain, but unfortunately for her Midoriya was in no mood to listen. The verdant archangel, blood boiling and heart drumming a war hymn, reared back and punched the repentant girl before him straight in the gut. Ugh! Shiozaki choked on her own breath as the force of the strike lifted her body off the ground and forced all the air out of her lungs. The world slowed, the pious girl feeling herself remain airborne much longer than possible, as another revelation was visited upon her and her mind clicked more pieces into place. Those girls she'd seen as affronts to nature, they weren't mere undead, enslaved by the darkest magics and bound to a master. Hark, they were vengeful spirits, souls wronged in life and unable to find the justice they deserved before their deaths. But such phantoms were dangerous and needed something extremely powerful to both guide and control them. No mere cherub or angel would have measured up to the task. Which meant Midoriya wasn't just any angel. Even as pained as she was, Shiozaki gasped against the knowledge she'd just discovered. Midoriya was the angel of death. Good night, bitch. Turns out, a broken neck did nothing to stop a zombie girl. Still mid-flight, Saki captured Shiozaki in a tight embrace from behind. With her momentum already having guided her body upward, the blonde had little trouble transitioning the airborne grapple into a perfectly applied suplex as the two descended. The vine-haired heroine in training was slammed back and headfirst into the hard concrete of the arena, cracking the floor tiles. She did not move afterward. And the winner is. Midnight started forward, being careful to keep a side eye on Midoriya as she passed the Verdunette. Noticing glistening emerald orbs gazing back at her questioningly, the 18+ only heroine continued, Midoriya by knockout. Not a soul in the stadium cheered, the audience too distraught by what they just witnessed. What the heck just happened? Present Mike cutting off his usual screaming halfway through his own question was indicative of exactly how unsure those watching from the stands felt about what had just occurred. They just had front row seats to a clear win by the emitter-type Shiozaki fall apart in seconds as the mutant-type Midoriya had torn through her quirk before striking her down when she'd been defenseless before him. The blonde pro himself was more confused because he'd looked away for a second to chug a can of tea when he'd been sure Shiozaki was going to win. What? He needed to soothe his vocal cords every once in a while due to his quirk. I didn't look away but I'm still not exactly sure. Hearing his own stalwart homeroom teacher hesitate like that sent Izuku into a panic. Everything had moved too fast there at the end for him to understand what was going on. Had something happened? Before her boss could get himself in a tizzy, Saki came up and placed a supportive hand on the Verdunette's shoulder in a clear sign of support. Suddenly the jumbo screens above the stadium flickered on and replayed the final moments of the match. Camera angles zoomed in on Izuku, cut back to back to back, and Izuku finally noticed what had gotten the public in such a state. The larger-than-life display first played at normal speed, failing to catch how Izuku had sent Shiozaki flying. One frame he was staring her down with glowing crimson eyes, the next she was airborne and his eyes were green once more. Then, thankfully, a second playthrough began, running in slow motion. This time the Verdunette's movement was visible, as a blurred motion. Ah, there it is. He just punched her. How the hell is that, just a punch? Tuning out the now arguing pros up top, Izuku turned to Midnight for further instruction, just in case. The necromancer's concerns were for naught, however, as the pro-heroine merely motioned for him to return to his waiting room with a gentle look. With a thankful nod, he headed off to do just that. Fist bumping as they left the arena, Izuku and Saki hurried away. If the two walked a bit faster than needed to escape the scrutinizing gaze and suspicious mutterings of the public, well, that was no one's concern but theirs. That didn't keep those watching from the stands, both pros and civilians alike, from mulling over what they'd just seen for themselves. Around the world, viewers who'd tuned into the UA Sports Festival were discussing the upset. Nothing clicked with what they knew to be true, nothing fit. Nothing they'd see so far would have led them to ever imagine what had just happened to be possible. A general sense of confusion began to spread. How did a mutant type, and a dark one at that, manage to pull off a move that was more than worthy of an emitter type? How had a dark quirk user like that even managed to enter such a prestigious hero school like UA? What was UA doing to keep such a concerning student in check? And most importantly, was Izuku Midoriya really a mutant type at all? From his place in the stands, the flame hero Endeavor grinned like a madman. His suspicions had been correct. Cursed blood offered enhancements to the user's body far beyond what mere physical exercise and training could achieve. And under his direction, a tool wielding such a quirk combined with that of his own creation would have infinite potential. Not even the most inhuman of legends would be able to stand against such a force. It was time he took what he deserved. His legacy would prevail. Aichi Prefecture, the Azui household. Ainko, how did your son pull off that move? Baru Azui asked her much younger-looking friend, stumped at what they'd just seen on the television. Enhanced speed and strength aren't part of his quirk profile, are they? Karo. The Azui matriarch was worried, and with good reason. This was going to cause the younger Midoriya problems on both sides of the spectrum. On one hand, she had no doubt that quirkists would have a field day demonizing her soon-to-be son-in-law for the new abilities the world had just witnessed. Far too many of those bigots would see him as either a threat to their worldview, or themselves, or both. On the other hand, she could already hear the quirk breeders coming out of the woodwork to get their hands on cursed blood to enhance the quirks of their own families. I don't know. Inko murmured, holding her chin while in deep thought. It was incredible to see that the youthful-looking mother was already able to completely ignore the tadpoles climbing all over her, gushing about how amazing and cool their sister's boyfriend, their new big brother, was. I just hope he isn't starving right now. Baru nearly face-vaulted. Unfortunately, she also knew that the concern was a legitimate one. Izuku, for all his amazing and seemingly otherworldly powers, was incredibly dependent on the nutrients stored within his own body. After witnessing his sudden increase in speed and strength, there was no doubt in the frogwoman's mind that there would surely be a high price to pay for it. A little apart from the two women and children, one Ganma Azui was making the first of his own moves. I know, but I want you to keep a closer eye on the kid. I haven't trusted that school's security since they switched to mainly robotic enforcement, Ganma whispered into his cell phone. A webbed hand came up and dragged down his face in exasperation. Consider it a favor then. I'll pay for drinks after this. Oh fine, and it can be an extra big bowl of ramen too, yes, with extra fish. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Waiting Room #1. The waiting rooms in the sports stadium were meant to be sanctuaries for competitors to hole up in prior to their matches so that they could focus on the fight ahead, but those same students could make use of them afterward as well if they needed to. For a certain young necromancer, this was a much appreciated blessing. His last match had shown him something, something he'd only ever dared dream about before, knowing full well it was likely far beyond the realm of true possibility. But now he wasn't so sure anymore. Did he have the power to actually fight for himself? The mental tribulation the Verdinet was currently experiencing seemed like it was more than enough justification for him to seclude himself for a short while. He needed to regain his focus, and quick, if he wanted a chance at understanding his new capabilities before his next match. And, well, his classmates didn't need to see the depths of his voracious appetite. Izuku was scarfing down anything and everything edible that was placed before him. His own personal little angel and saint, Lily and Tay, were waiting on him, their arms full of whatever they'd managed to raid from the nearest vending machines. If the duo had been allowed to leave the hallway, they'd have hit the food stands outside the stadium as well, but the Verdinet knew they'd done their best. He was beyond grateful for their thoughtfulness. Aizuenii needs to eat, Aizuenii needs to grow, Lily sang happily as she passed more chocolate and bread to her big brother to messily devour. Lily knows Aizuenii will be the champion, yo. The littlest zombie's cheering was followed and accompanied by encouraging grunts from Tay. Saki was absent, but the rebellious blonde, somewhat skilled in skulking around unnoticed, had been sent to check in on Tsuchan, and maybe bring back more snacks. Her mission helped Izuku's nerves in more ways than one, as the delinquent hadn't been able to shut up about how badass her boss had looked laying into Shiozaki. Or how he'd soon be having a lot of, well, she hadn't said girls, but Izuku understood her vulgar word choice easily enough, throwing themselves at him. Thanks, Lily, Izuku said, chewing on the last snack he'd been given, a stick of dango. I guess all we can do is wait now. I don't know who our next opponent will be yet, but between Tetsu-san and Ishido-san, either one will be a difficult challenge. The two zombie girls present nodded solemnly in understanding. Whatever the future threw at them, they knew they'd face it all together as a family. Cock-lick-click. Cock-lick-click. The door to the waiting room shook as its doorknob was throttled, but it stood fast and refused to open. Izuku tensed, but not by much. He'd locked that door himself. He knew whoever it was wasn't Saki. He'd have been able to feel the blondes arrive long before she'd reached the door, and it wasn't like the would-be intruder would be able to enter and bother him any. HSSSSS. The doorknob suddenly turned a glowing red. Seconds later, it melted clean off the door and dropped into a puddle on the ground. Well, that narrowed down who was trying to get in at least. But why would Todoroki go to such trouble? As the door swung open, the blazing form of Japan's second greatest pro hero, Endeavor, was revealed. Okay, so it was the worst Todoroki? Shit. Sir, Izuku said immediately, doing his best to remain calm while also heading off what was sure to be a stressful conversation one way or another. I'm pretty sure you shouldn't be here. Please leave before this causes both of us trouble. It was an entirely justified response. All it would take was a single complaint from Izuku about this, and his dual-colored classmate would be penalized, if not outright disqualified. Interference of any sort against festival competitors, like say one's father speaking to a possible future opponent, could easily be taken as an act of sabotage. Unfortunately for the Verdinet, the flame hero didn't seem to care about this fact. Quit your yapping, boy, Endeavor groused sternly, glaring as he entered the waiting room without waiting, or asking, for permission. The large man kicked out one of the chairs opposite his target and sat himself down, completely ignoring the warning growls from the two undead across from him. I will have words with you. Izuku found that he really didn't like the tone that the number 2 hero used, much less what it implied. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena? Just look at her go, folks. UA's pink daredevil is darting around her prey like a vicious hummingbird. Can Tetsu medal keep him going? Can his medal win the day? Mina was having a blast. Long gone was any anxiety she'd felt about her little wardrobe malfunction. Gone too was any lingering insecurities she'd had about herself and her best friend. Now she was filled with a sense of fulfillment. And determination. Splash. Twisting into a corkscrew midair, Mina avoided another hammer strike from the boy who many said was identical to Eijiro Kirishima. As a parting gift, the pinkette slung a gout of acid as her hands curved around her, the liquid splashing against her opponent's metal forearm. It was so freeing, finally getting rid of that ugly feeling of jealousy she'd been unable to shake off ever since Tsuyu had declared, and confirmed, she'd landed herself a boyfriend. Mina knew it was no small matter for the mutant girl, she would know, and even if the conditions surrounding said achievement weren't the best, it still put her far ahead of their peers. Boom! Another failure by the metal man of Class 1B, this time a stomp. The brutal move produced a lot of debris, but it hadn't even come close to landing on the horned girl, who'd already flipped out of the way with a cartwheel. The crowd was going wild, cheering loudly as the match continued. Many were calling her name, shouting out how good she looked, but Mina's large smile had nothing to do with such gregarious support. In fact, it was her trophy, her badge of success, that was making her grin so widely. With her shirt, and her sports bra, accidentally destroyed by her own acid, Mina had thought that she'd be out of luck, and had been steeling herself for having to withdraw from the tournament. Finding a replacement that would fit her generous assets would have been a hassle, and she couldn't ask any of the other girls to borrow their outfits in case she melted through them again. That's when her newly minted boyfriend had come to her rescue. Kiri had almost flown out of his gym shirt he'd been wearing. He'd wanted to give it to her so fast. She'd been struck by a giggle fit at the sight, which had turned into honest laughter when she'd pointed out the garment was almost as much of a mess as her own had been at that point. The lovable doof had blushed as red as his hair, and then given her the real treasure. How he'd gotten it so quickly was still a mystery to her, but Kiri had given her one of his casual shirts, actually the one she knew he'd been wearing before changing into his gym uniform for the festival. The garment had smelled like him, of course. No doubt he'd spent hours working out in it, every fiber becoming infused with his potent sweat. Oh, the aroma of moss and sawdust. Mina would never tell a soul that she'd secreted something else besides her acid when she'd first put it on and taken a deep whiff. She'd basked in happiness until the very moment her name had been called for her next match. Don't mistake this match as being a carbon copy of Ashido's last. It's obvious she's learned from her previous mistakes. She's keeping her normally highly erratic style more measured this time, making sure to prevent a repeat of what happened before. If she can keep these more controlled, energetic moves going, well, that's a question we'll just have to wait and see the answer to. Why did Aizawa-sensei have to be so right all the time? Mina could tell she was flagging, her moves slowing bit by bit. The sharp smell of her own sweat, mixed with that earthiness of Kiri's, was giving her spurts of vigor whenever she could catch a sniff. Even so, the pinkette wasn't sure if she'd be able to keep this kind of energy going into another match. But she did know that as long as she kept moving right now, she'd sure as hell have a good chance of winning here. GHA. Dropping into a short flare to avoid a punch had Tetsu stumble back to avoid her swinging legs in turn, allowing Mina to pop up in a spin and sling another glob of acid directly on the metal teen's chest. To no one's surprise this time, the horned girl's quirk ate through the last threads keeping his shirt on, and the garment fell apart immediately. For a single second, Mina found herself distracted. Now, the pinkette would openly admit that, prior to an hour ago, she'd been a huge believer in the idea that people should be able to appreciate the bodies of others. But now, seeing another boy's bare torso after feeling up Kiri's, it just wasn't the same. Almost subconsciously, she began to compare her opponent to her boyfriend, and she found Tetsu to be much less interesting. Kiri's angular musculature looked much more delicious than the chromed copy's more rounded edges. Not to mention, such wayward thinking cost the pinkette dearly. Whoa! All it took was stepping back on a loose bit of debris that her opponent had created earlier when he'd missed an overpowered strike. The half-second it took for Mina to regain her footing was more than enough for Tetsu to launch a long-overdue counter. Gra-gra! The steely teen's roar caught Mina by surprise. Refocusing on the fight, she was just in time to see a massive piece of concrete being tossed her way. Kia! Mina couldn't contain her yelp as she stumbled away as quickly as she could, no fancy dance moves coming to mind in her panic. Watching the projectile sail by her, the pinkette counted her lucky stars she was so nimble. Getting hit by that would have been the end of her. It was time to get serious. Turning back to glare at her opponent, seriously, who threw rocks in a fight? Mina came face to face with an angry cannonball. Wham! The collision caused a worldwide flinch. The metal man of Class 1B had successfully landed a tackle on the pink-haired daredevil of Class 1A after being picked apart for the better part of 15 minutes. Too bad that wasn't the end of it. Crunch! Gah-ha! Mina screamed in complete and utter agony, the public at large cringing in sympathetic pain. Tetsu had gone full out, using all of his metal-backed strength, and the pinkette hadn't been able to position herself in time before their collision so that the resulting fall wouldn't hurt her. As a result, when the steel teen had put his full weight into the tackle and she'd fallen under him, Mina's shoulder had dislocated. As if in a frenzy, Tetsu hadn't stopped there. Remembering his lesson from Class 1B's villain test, to never give the enemy a chance, the steel teen proceeded to put his opponent into a submission hold. The move further twisted the horned girl's injured arm. Ah-ha! The tortured shriek that ripped from Mina's lips. Tetsu was instantly sent back to that nightmarish moment when his stupidity had seriously hurt someone he hadn't even realized was precious to him. Snapping out of his war trance, Tetsu frantically scrambled back from the screaming pinkette under him. Jumping to his feet, the manly man of Class 1B worriedly looked up to the stands where he knew his classmates were seated. There, cheering along with the rest of their friends while pumping her fist in the air in a clear sign of support, was the one person he wanted to see right at that moment. Just seeing her okay made him feel better. Pony stared back, seeming to catch his eye. The blonde exchange student began waving her hands enthusiastically, clearly supporting a drive for victory. Tetsu nodded and turned back to his opponent. To see Midnight had come onto the arena and was checking the down pinkette. Competitor Tetsu, Midnight said, holding up a hand, please remain where you are for a moment. The R-rated heroine had given the order because she needed a second. Even as a combat simulation, where injuries were expected, seeing a student wail in such pain was still a harrowing sight to see. To make matters worse, she'd experienced this type of injury before, so the Ravenet knew that what happened next could go either way. Checking over her downed student as gently as she could, the pro-heroine nodded to herself. Thankfully there weren't any broken bones. UA preached going beyond, but fighting with broken bones on top of dislocated joints was a quick way to retirement or lost dreams. Now, to test the resolve of this girl. Competitor Ashido, Midnight called out, keeping up an indifferent and impartial mask to cover her actual worry for the pinkette. Can you continue? Mina couldn't immediately reply, the pain was too great. Instead, the horned teen curled into a ball while taking hold of her limp arm. She didn't want to give up. She wanted to show everyone that she was a winner, someone capable of being a heroine. Even if Midoriya just pushed her right out of bounds at the start of their match. She wanted to win. I can. Mina grit out weakly, pushing herself up into a kneeling position. Her grip on her limp arm tightened fiercely. She knew what she had to do. She'd even seen Midoriya do it a couple of times now. There'd been a heroic session once, earlier in the year, where the Verdinet had dislocated his shoulder after a spar had gone a little too far. He'd done the same in the middle of a battle trial soon after. Each time the freckled teen had made it look so easy to fix, simply yank the limb back into place, give a cute little ouch, and carry on as if nothing had happened. I can do it. Mina roared as she did exactly as she'd seen, and yanked on her limp arm as hard as she could. Crunch. Kaha. This time, when the pinkette shrieked in pain, there were tears. There were also winces from the audience, and gasps of horror at the sight. It was easy for the civilians to forget in their quirk society just how fragile the human body actually was, and how painful injuries still were. The pros watching, however, merely gave commiserating nods, well acquainted with such pain and injuries. It was a daily hazard of their careers, and they'd just inducted a new member into the club. Well, folks. Has the daredevilish hummingbird lost a wing? What will that mean for her? Can she stand, or is this the end of her flight? Can you do it, Ashido-san? Midnight asked, this time foregoing her mic. The Ravenet forced her voice to keep itself cold. Students needed to realize that in school combat, just like in the real world, there was no room for emotional distractions. Can you stand? Injuries, pain, fatigue. These are the conditions that we, as pro-heroes, will always need to overcome out in the field. One of the most important skills we hone at UA is a student's sense of their own limitations. Heroes must know their limits, realize how much pain they can tolerate when carrying out a mission, understand which injuries can be ignored for the sake of saving lives. A dead hero? A handicapped hero, both are ultimately useless. Ashido needs to evaluate herself right now, and if she finds she can't handle her injury, accept that she must leave the battlefield. Ashido-san. Midnight tried again, easily noticing the pinkette struggling to overcome her pain. If you can't, I can do it. Mina interrupted shakily, forcing her body to obey her commands. Using what remaining strength she had, the pinkette pushed every bit of her will into getting her legs to straighten, to support her weight. She stood up. Competitor Ashido has decided to continue. Midnight's redundant declaration was met with loud cheers and raucous applause. Against the odds, the pinkette had garnered quite a number of fans in a short amount of time. The 18-plus only heroine stepped back, sharp eyes picking up just how wobbly the pinkette was now. The Ravenet shook her head. She knew exactly how this was going to play out. But as a teacher, the least she could do was accept the choice of the incredibly brave and foolish girl before her. Tetsu kept his eyes on Midnight until he was given a nod of affirmation, and the fight began again. Hapaiya! The steely teen roared as he charged forward. He'd decided while he'd been waiting that he would answer the manly feelings of his opponent. He'd show her just how seriously he considered her resolve to win. If she wanted to go out with a bang, he'd gladly provide her that final push toward glory. Then he skidded to a stop. Only a few steps away from his opponent, Tetsu saw that her eyes were devoid of consciousness. Before he could ask Midnight what he was supposed to do, Mina simply fell face first to the ground. Thud. And Tetsu wins the match, Midnight declared, face remaining impassive, by knockout. The Metal Man of Class 1B felt conflicted. A victory like this left a foul taste in his mouth, it was just so unmanly. Then again, it was a victory, and he knew he needed to learn to accept that not all victories were going to feel good. Seeing his red-headed copycat from Class 1A, Kirishima, rush out from an exit tunnel and immediately run over to gather the pinkette into his arms helped Tetsu feel a little bit better too. Even better, instead of berating him for how the match turned out, the hardening user focused entirely on the girl he now held, spilling out a litany of encouraging words to her as he carried her away. Tetsu stood there for a moment longer. It was a surreal experience. There was clapping and cheers all around him, and he didn't really care. He'd won, and in the field, that was all that mattered. Glory and fame meant nothing to him now if they got his precious people hurt. Or killed. We're halfway through, folks. Let's get ready for the second half. Let's see some energy, yeah. I just want a match where the competitors don't go overboard. UA Sports Festival Stadium, waiting room #1. Izuku stared at the thing, sitting across from him, an incredulous look on his face. What this thing posing as a man had just proposed, demanded even, it was. Are you insane? The Verdinet asked, tilting his head in honest shock and confusion. Tay hadn't stopped growling the entire time, ready at a moment's notice to attack. Even Lily was glaring at the fiery intruder, from where she hid behind her big brother, but still. Oh? Endeavor replied, a flaming eyebrow rising in contemptuous question. The temperature of the room rose ever so slightly with the number 2 hero's irritation. He'd heard this drivel all before. They always called him crazy, or insane, or a monster before bowing to his might. Or his money. Same difference. And what's so insane about my proposal? How about we start with everything? Izuku shot back just as calmly, using cursed blood heavily to keep his heart rate level and his tongue still. In case you didn't know, I already have a beautiful girlfriend who I love with all my heart. And I'm lucky enough that she loves me back. So right there is reason enough for me to not marry your daughter, who I've never met. Endeavor growled, his frustrations confirmed. That ugly mutant bitch had already gotten to his target and had poisoned his mind. If he wasn't furious with the freak at that moment, he'd applaud Baru Azui for such a skillful move. Really, using her daughter to ensnare the naivety of youth with such an archaic notion as love? What a ridiculous farce. Whatever the Azui have promised you, you know that I can easily double, no, triple it, correct? Endeavor asked, trying again. The man knew from experience that love was only as deep as the wallet of the individual in question. If you're concerned about the repercussions from their firm. No, Izuku cut in, tightening a fist under the table out of sight from the pro-hero. It was strange, he was beginning to feel angry, but the volatile emotion wasn't singing through his veins this time. I don't care about your money, and I don't care about your status or what you can do for me. I care about Tsuchan, and I'm not betraying her. Yeah. Tsune is the best for Aizu and I. Lily added, doing her best to sound brave even when the fiery man really scared her. And, Lily thinks that the fireman's family is bad in the head anyway. The glare that Endeavor turned toward the littlest zombie was dark enough that Lily had to bury her face in her big brother's back before she broke down and cried. There was murder in those eyes. She'd know. Go ahead, number 2, just try it. The unexpected addition of an unknown player into the standoff only seemed to make it worse. Touch even a single hair on anyone inside this room, and you won't like the consequences, the intruder continued, voice turning condescending, like a teacher reprimanding a student too stupid to understand what they'd done wrong multiple times. You do remember what those are, I hope? How does being removed from the hero ranking sound? Or having your little science project blacklisted from every hero school in Japan? Naya. Both Izuku and Endeavor turned to the door of the waiting room, still hanging ajar after the number 2 hero's abrupt and unwanted entrance. The sight that greeted them was that of an adorable-looking catboy, face scrunched as he tried his best to look serious and intimidating. He was also holding up some sort of official-looking card. Who do you think you are? Endeavor spat, flames billowing upward as he barely contained his fury. Izuku made to stand, ready to protect this child who'd so unwisely pissed off the flaming bastard he'd been stuck speaking to. Before he could fully get to his feet, he noticed Endeavor flinch back as the kid stepped close enough to shove his card in the man's face. What the hell are you doing here? Endeavor barked, oddly enough seeming to be working on keeping his words and tone measured. What business is this of some meddlesome QRA dog? I'm a cat, actually, the catboy grinned back, boldly stepped around the flame hero and climbing up to stand on a chair so both living occupants in the room could see him clearly. And I'm doing my job. The kiddo here has caught the eye of quite a few people you know, the UN included. We're keeping a close eye on him too, of course. So go ahead, push your luck. See where it gets you. You're already going to get it for being here in the first place, you know this room's off limits. Endeavor seemed ready to erupt like a volcano, his skin reddening and his flames growing out of control. Snarling, the pro-hero turned back to Izuku, slapping down a plastic container on the table along with a fat roll of yen notes. The roll was thicker than a soda can. Fine then, Endeavor grit out through clenched teeth. Wallow in the much with animals then boy, I don't care. Fill that up and I'll be on my way. Izuku stared at the man in absolute incredulity while the Catboy looked like he'd just choked on a hairball. Did the number 2 hero really just? Fuck. No. The impudent denial was the last straw. Endeavor had never known defeat save against the infuriating idiot known as All Might, and he was going to get what he came for, damn it. If he had to get a little rough with the brat, so be it. And if the QRA agent had to suffer a little accident and disappear, well, it wouldn't be the first time. The roiling fire that covered the flame hero began to grow, roaring hungrily as it consumed more fuel. It was ready to burn. FFFSSSSHHHHHHHHH. Until the frothy cloud of a fire extinguisher's foam doused Endeavor like a wet candle. Holy shit. Saki's voice filled the room, the blonde's brutal grin audible as she stepped into sight with the extinguisher in hand. You really know how to heat things up, boss? Endeavor wiped off his face, his flames already rising once more. Before, it was business, but now he was going to enjoy. A massive hand clapped down on the number 2 hero's shoulder, the air pressure from the action alone strong enough to put out his flames instantly. Endeavor. My old friend and rival. All Might cheerfully greeted, the number 1 hero grinning as always. However, there was an unmistakable edge to his boisterous voice. Why don't we take a walk? You look lost. With that, Japan's greatest hero dragged its second best away, ignoring the man's growls the entire time. From his spot atop the chair, Nianta quickly slid down and crumbled bonelessly to the floor, trembling. His eyes were glassy and tears were threatening to fall down his lightly furred cheeks. I wasn't made for this kinda shit. The diminutive supervising agent whined, I think I just lost 3 from that. Saki-chan. Izuku said, discreetly calling for his most rebellious partner. I wouldn't mind if, next time, you hit him with that thing. The undead delinquent dutifully saluted with a vicious grin. That was an order she would be happy to obey. Maybe we should leave? Lily suggested, looking at the now wide-open door with worry. Lily thinks that the fiery man will return if we stay too long. Izuku nodded. Once the security of a place was breached, any feelings of safety it once had were gone. And besides, at that moment, all he wanted was to cuddle up with Tsuchan. He really needed it right about now. Omake, what's in a name? For Henry Baumeister. Once again, Izuku found himself overseeing the restoration of the beach he had, by some fucked up turn of luck, come to own. Although honestly, he shouldn't be letting himself get too bent out of shape about it still if he were being truthful. Everything was actually going pretty well all things considered. The girls had finished cleaning up in record time, they'd built sturdy shacks that were firm enough to be counted as official housing, and the fence being erected around the perimeter was close to being finished. He'd have to look into getting the girls actual homes though, or get them the materials to build their own, but for now the beach was almost ready for inspection by the police chief. If it got a green light from him, it was ready to be open to the public again. One of his only gripes about the day though, was that Saki still hadn't moved from where she'd stopped to glare at the large sign placed atop the main shack yet. The blonde was glaring at it so hard that Izuku was pretty sure the whole thing would go up in flames any minute now. How in the fucking hell? The delinquent growled, did that cutesy-ass name survive? The innocent sign? It read Doremi. In English. Izuku personally didn't find anything wrong with it. Lily thinks it's a good name. Lily announced, prepared to dart behind her big brother for protection if needed. Strangely, her mean older sister never responded to her bait. Reiko! Saki suddenly bellowed, freezing all of the girls in place, why the hell didn't you change the fucking name? Before the aforementioned girl could respond, the blonde had shot off like a rocket, chasing the violet all over the beach. From where he stood, Izuku watched the scene unfold, still confused. The name wasn't that bad. In fact, it actually sounded perfect for the club. It made the girls sound friendly regardless of how passionate they could be. What's so wrong with that name? Izuku asked aloud, not really expecting an answer. Perhaps this Kuriko could explain? Jumping slightly, Izuku whipped around to see a small girl, sporting a frame so thin he worried she was sick, had snuck up on him from seemingly out of nowhere. The brunette had her hair in a set of twintails, and had an incredibly serious look on her face. "'Tis a forbidden topic to be sure, but as you are the overboss, it's your right to know." Izuku sighed. It was bad enough when Saki called him boss, but now these girls had taken it to the extreme. He doubted he'd ever get used to the over-the-top moniker. Ah, this Kuriko remembers it clearly, Kuriko said, looking into the distance as she began to recount the tale. It all began when... flashback. It had taken a great deal of effort, of pain and blood and tears, but the gang was finally growing, both in numbers and territory. To commemorate such momentous achievements, Saki had had a fantastic idea. The girls were going to get together and paint the town red, well, paint the town with their gang's name anyway. It'd be all over the place. If they'd conquered it, it would be there. In English. This is going to be awesome. Reiko had shouted to the four winds, Saki will be so proud of us. At the last minute, their boss, the young woman who'd gathered them together when they'd been nothing but broken pussies, the one who'd turned them into a force of nature no one would mess with, had been called away. Saki Nikaido hadn't been able to be there for their graffiti spree after all. But none of the girls had complained though. Their boss's old man was surprisingly alright, and he'd needed her help in restoring an ancient 2000 Mustang of all things. Honestly, there wasn't a member of the gang who wouldn't have gladly killed to be allowed to even touch such an antique. Certainly, Makoto, one of the high-ranking members, had seconded. The tall, short-haired brunette had looked so proud of their handiwork. The name of our gang will be immortalized as of today. There's not going to be a single person who won't know of us. Cheers and boisterous laughter had filled the alley of their last tagging, the last bit of territory that had needed their name stamped on it. In the background, standing apart from the joyful chattering, a newer blood member had only sighed in exasperation. These girls had meant well, but the boss was an actual badass that, while similar to the one Isama that had broken her heart, had guided them all to a better fate than they would have had alone. But there had been some dysfunctional misunderstanding somewhere along the line. The boss is going to be really upset. The short girl had muttered to herself, this Kuriko just knows it. When Saki had first named the gang, she'd taken the kanji involved and used their sounds in the English language to shorten it to an easier-to-remember logo. They were the beautiful raging demons. Thus, shortened they were. Do-re-mi. Kuriko had mustered the courage to look up at the gigantic tag written in English letters once again. It had been one of an identical set of 10 spread out all across the city. Do-re-mi. The boss was going to. Oi! Saki's voice had filled the alley, silencing the girls in a heartbeat as they instantly gave her their full attention. What's the fucking meaning of that? Isn't it the greatest fucking thing? Reiko had replied with a huge grin, obviously proud of herself. She'd put up the tags with the other girls all by themselves. Saki had to be proud of them too. Just as you'd wanted, boss, Makoto had added, her seriousness doing wonders at adding fuel to the enraged blonde's already violent mood. Now the name of our gang will be known everywhere. Kuriko had made herself as small as possible, inching closer to a nearby container. She'd known what was about to happen. You fucking morons. With that war cry, Saki had begun to, passionately, explain to her girls how exactly they had fucked up. End of flashback. And on that day, Kuriko said, reaching the end of her story, this Kuriko learned that the boss can accurately strike a target at 200 meters, with a wrench. Izuku looked at the thin girl with a deadpan stare. On one hand, he wanted to berate the girls for their lack of common sense. On the other, he'd rather they keep the cutesy name. It was better for the beach in his opinion. You know what? Whatever. Izuku decided not to interfere further, he had more pressing matters to attend to. Saki. Gather up the girls. It was time to give Do-re-mi a long-term project. The beach needed to be reopened to the public, and the girls needed money to make a living. In a different timeline, Izuku might have told the girls to just finish their work and open the beach to the public as it was, only keeping an eye on it to keep it clean. However, after dealing with how their society worked for so long, this Izuku had decided that if the public wanted a beautiful place to visit and stroll through, then they needed to pay for it. It was only fair. Make dream come true, for all about nothing. Cloistered away inside the Azui household, 2 mothers and 2 children had been watching the yearly UA Sports Festival together with bated breath. The pair of mothers had been on the edge of their seats the whole time, their hearts nearly failing multiple times as they watched their children. Just recently they'd barely survived a powerful attack from one of their competitors. At the same time, the tadpoles with them continued to cheer for their big sister and her boyfriend. To them, it was beyond cool how the two looked as they earned victory after victory. Then, it happened. For one reason or another, Tsuyu had taken hold of Izuku's head and pulled the verdinette down to eye level. Then she'd given him an incredibly passionate kiss. On live television. That was being broadcast to the entire world? Samidare and Satsuki didn't understand what was happening, of course, but their mothers were sporting large grins and were actually about to jump out of their seats. Then their big sister and her boyfriend finally separated and Marry me. Crash. Inko had dropped the mug she'd been holding. The young-looking woman held back a waterfall of tears, her eyes now unfocused as she fanned herself. Baru, always so unflappable, seemed frozen in place. My little baby boy, Inko whispered, slowly rising to her feet, is becoming a man. Remaining at her spot on the couch, Baru pulled out a binder from who knows where, and opened it. Taking out a pen that had been kept in the binder, the frog woman began to write down dates. This event had just moved everything up. But she surely wasn't going to complain. Oh, my son is so manly. Inko shouted, unable to control herself any longer. Baru nearly croaked when the younger-looking mother ran to her and snagged her hands eagerly. Luckily she'd finished her quick scribbling just in time. Samidare and Satsuki still didn't understand, but this time it was about why their mother was doing a silly dance with Ms. Inko around the living room. The two adults were singing too, about weddings, dresses, paperwork, and grandchildren. It was all so weird. Deciding that it was just grown-ups being silly, the two returned their attention to the screen. In the hallway between the kitchen and the living room, hands full of snacks and more beverages, Ganma sighed to himself. He'd heard everything too, and he was happy about it of course, but what are they going to do when they remember Tsuchan actually has to say yes first? The father of three certainly hoped this moment of brightness wasn't a prelude to further problems with the festival. That Todoroki boy seemed like a bomb with a short fuse, and Izuku had made it clear he wasn't going to avoid striking matches. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. Support the writer. Don't forget to like, sub and share.